Marc Dutroux, the most hated man in Europe.
These are some of the most horrendous crimes that any criminologist will ever come across.
A makeshift dungeon below a house in Marcinelle.
Others were buried alive.
How has Marc Dutroux been able to operate so freely and for so long?
He knew that he was not going to be caught, that he was protected in some way.
Tapes that allow him to blackmail a minister.
He is simply a small player in a much bigger criminal conspiracy.
Big businessmen, there were also politicians.
Also people from the police.
1, 2, several children. They had sex with him, of course.
Belgians lost faith in their judicial system and accused the courts of colluding with the killers.
Belgium stands on the brink of revolution.
Marc Dutroux is a monster, plain and simple.
June 7th, 1985. A 29-year-old monster was having dinner with his wife Michelle and a man named Jean Pettingham, a penniless drifter that the monster and his wife had taken into their care, but not out of the kindness of their non-existent hearts, as we will soon see. At some point that night, the monster suggested to Jean that the two of them, quote, go out and have some fun. In spite of the protest from Michelle, she apparently knew exactly the kind of fun that the monster was proposing here. The monster hopped in his wife's van before he and Jean pulled it out of the driveway and hit the road. It wasn't long before the monster spotted a young girl, Sylvie D, on her way home from a local swimming pool and pointed her out to Jean. Jean turned back and asked, "Isn't she a bit young?" The monster replied, "Just my type."
I've known Jeff for 15 years. Terrific guy. It has even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side.
I'm going to be dating her in 10 years. Can you believe it?
The monster then ordered Jean, apparently acting as his henchman lackey in exchange for living under his roof, to jump out of the van and grab the young girl. And before she even knew what was happening, young Sylvie was snatched by her waist and yanked into the pair's van before they drove off back toward the monster's house of horrors. Sylvie was only 11 years old, and the name of the monster who had taken her is Marc Dutroux. Through this video, you will learn of the many atrocities committed by Dutroux, his connections to a vast child trafficking network involving powerful businessmen and corrupt politicians, and how those men use their power to engage in one of the most obvious and blatant cover-ups that I have ever seen to protect their own child-abusing asses. You'll learn why all of this led Dutroux to be known as the Jeffrey Epstein of Europe, and why Belgians then and to this day refer to him as Le Monstre, or in English, simply as the Monster. This video is technically one entry in my massive project covering the so-called CIA iceberg, so toward the end, I'll be explaining to you exactly how the Central Intelligence Agency could be connected to the monster himself. I'd love to give credit to Le Monstre, a fantastic podcast series on Dutroux, and a primary source for much of this video's content. And I'd also like to make clear that we are going to be diving deep into a world of disgusting, violent depravity, much of which involves children. And viewer discretion is very, very advised. And with that, let's return to October 17th, 1985. 19-year-old Maria V was walking home from the store when she felt someone come up from behind and violently shove her into the open door of Marc's dirty white van before he and Jean peeled off. December 14th, 1985. Axel D, a student at the University of Brussels, went to visit her hometown for the weekend. As she got off the bus, she noticed a dirty white van that she thought might be following her. This time, Marc's wife Michelle was behind the wheel. Jean hopped out from the back and got in position, and when the van lined up with Axel, the doors flew open. Jean rushed up to Axel and pushed her in as Marc pulled her from inside. Axel's vision suddenly went black as Marc covered her eyes in masking tape before the van sped away. December 18th, 4 days later, 15-year-old Elizabeth G was riding her bike to school when she suddenly felt herself being ripped off the pedals. Before she knew it, she too was inside the dirty white van, which sped off as quickly as it had shown up. January 17th, 1986. The pair abducted 18-year-old Catherine B, by now their fifth proven victim, although Jean later told police the pair had kidnapped 2 other girls before any of these incidents occurred. After all of these girls were taken, Marc, his wife Michelle, and Jean would repeatedly abuse them, sexually and physically while filming all of these events. Now, thankfully, the trio did eventually release all 5 of these girls after various periods of time, sparing their lives, but stealing their ability to live the happy, unbothered ones that they enjoyed before they had to deal with the crushing trauma that these sick freaks had left them with for the rest of their lives. Now, Jean Pettingham, apparently, and this does make a bit of sense given that he was a homeless drifter before being taken in by Mark, was not exactly the world's smartest man. The guy liked to talk, and was apparently a bit of a narcissist, as the main topic he liked to talk about was himself, which is not exactly the best activity to engage in when you're in the middle of, abusing young girls whom you've just abducted before returning them back to the streets. Jean had talked about himself around and even directly to these girls to such an extent, in fact, that police, after talking to these 5 victims, quickly gathered enough info about Jean from the girls to easily track him down. Really, the guy seriously must have just been like, wow, I, John Pettingham, am just so happy to be here at 308 Negra Arroyo Lane, my personal address, engaging in vicious crimes. I sure am John Pettingham, and I love doing bad, illegal stuff with my blue eyes, 6'4" husky frame, and distinctive tattoo on my right shoulder. Golly gee, am I John Pettingham. All right, that's P-E-T-E-G-H-A-M, if you're wondering. Yep, John Pettingham. The cops soon searched Pettingham's address, where they found a pencil case that the pair had stolen, which belonged to one of their victims. With the testimony and this damning evidence, they arrested John on February 3rd, and after being relentlessly, unforgivingly questioned for like 30 seconds, Jean broke down and admitted to all 5 kidnappings, and that he had not acted alone. After outing Mark and Michelle, the police quickly arrested those 2 as well, but they were not as easy to coax answers out of than the broke vagabond. Michelle initially denied everything, then decided to admit everything, then said, hey, actually, all those things I just admitted to, never mind. Didn't actually do them at all. Didn't happen. So I'm just gonna go ahead and recount my confession there. Whoopsie daisy, really. Must have been thinking about 5 other brutal kidnappings. I've got a serious case of the Mondays. And finally, Mark Dutroux never admitted to any of it. But these confessions, recanted or otherwise, didn't really matter in the end, as in 1989, these 3 dirtbags were all found guilty, even though they were all given some disgustingly short sentences. Michelle was only sentenced to 5 years for these crimes, Pettingham 6.5, and Mark being sentenced to nearly 14. And that's the end of our little story here, right? Terrible acts were committed, but justice was sort of served in the end, at least in the eyes of the law, and nothing bad ever happened in Belgium ever again. Right? No, unfortunately, as you can see from this video's runtime, this is not the end of the story, but barely the beginning. Listen guys, I'm broke. Okay, I have no money. It's true. And like a lot of people right now, I've had to cancel a bunch of stuff just to pay for rent and food. But I still need to hide my IP address to protect my private information, avoid hackers, and watch shows on Netflix that aren't available in my country. I need it. I need that. And then I found out I can use private internet access for $2.03 a month with 4 months absolutely free, and you can too if you click my link in the description. A VPN is an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel to shield your digital life from those trying to exploit your private information. Using the internet without private internet access is like sitting on a see-through toilet in the middle of Times Square. Anyone can just stare right in and see you fighting for your life to push out that gas station sushi. And watching Netflix without private internet access is like paying for an entire large Supreme pizza and only getting 2 slices. It's a total ripoff. The Shawshank Redemption, Schindler's List, Inception, all movies I can't watch with my Netflix subscription in America, but with PIA, I just changed my location to Canada and can now watch all these movies and way, way more at no extra cost. And private internet access is special. It's not like those other girls, because you can use it on an unlimited number of devices to protect protect all your family and friends with just one person's plan. It never stores your data, which has been proven multiple times in court, and is one of the few VPNs that supports peer-to-peer file sharing. So what are you waiting for? Save money, watch all the shows in the world, and stay safe online by clicking my link in the description, or go to piavpn.com/necessary to get 83% off private internet access and only pay $2.03 a month with 4 months totally free. Click the link. After being locked up in '89, Dutroux spent his time posing as a model prisoner, even attending AA meetings to make it seem like he had worked hard to heal himself from an alcohol addiction that, in reality, he never even actually had. And, disturbingly, the prison actually seemed to believe the facade he was putting on here, as Dutroux was soon granted multiple temporary releases, which he would then use to go and visit his sick grandmother. During these visits, Mark was accompanied by a prison-issued guardian who Dutroux introduced to his sick grandmother simply as a friend, as her mental awareness was in a sharp decline at that point, and she did not even know that Mark was in prison at that time. And this prison-issued guardian eventually became quite impressed with the carefully constructed, compassionate persona that Mark put on here by kindly caring for his grandmother in front of him during these visits. And Mark was also aware that this particular prison-issued guardian just so happened to be a member of the prison's parole board. And just like that, with a few AA meetings and some theatrical hospice care for his grandmother, Mark Dutroux, convicted of abducting and sexually abusing 5 girls, one as young as 11, was released on parole after only serving 3 years. 3 years. Count them. 1, 2, 3. 3 years! Now, I know that the police, prisons, and the justice system in general are ripe with incompetence and filled to the brim with idiots. That's just obvious to anyone with a functional frontal lobe. But taking into account Mark's heinous, repeated crimes here and the ridiculously short time that he spent behind bars as punishment for them, one certainly does have to wonder whether this terrible, stupid decision by the prison here could exclusively be the result of only incompetence. Well, that question is going to be raised a lot throughout this story, and I think the answer to it will become clearer and clearer to you each time it is brought up. Now, there were many people who were obviously unhappy with this decision. The prosecutor, Mark's prison psychiatrist, who reported that he was still, quote, extremely dangerous, and hell, even Mark's own mother had written not 1, not 2, but several separate letters to her son's prison begging for them not to release her son, with one of said letters reading, quote, "I know Mark's stubbornness to achieve whatever he wants. What I don't know, and what everyone who knows him fears, is what he has in mind for the future." You will soon see how eerily foreshadowing those words are, and how whoever read them within this prison really should have known that there's nothing more powerful than a mother's intuition.
We saw 2 young girls walking along the street, and he said, "Do you want to earn 150,000 Belgian francs?" And I said, "Sure, but how?" And then he said, "We had to kidnap the girls first, and then he'd show me." And I said, "Listen, I don't go around kidnapping young girls." And he said, "Look, it's easy. You grab them from behind the neck with one arm, you cover their mouths, then you just throw them in the back of the van. You can knock them out if you need to." I said, "No way, I'm not going to do that." And after he dropped me off at home, I immediately called the police and reported it. It's too bad they didn't listen to me.
Apparently not serving her full, already much too short sentence of 5 years either, Mark's wife Michelle was already out of the clink before Mark's release date was even set. And when the day of Mark's release did arrive on April 8th, 1992, Mark and Michelle immediately put a sinister plot against the Belgian taxpayer into action. You see, while in prison, Mark had already managed to convince a healthcare worker that he was disabled due to mental illness, and upon his release, he and Michelle immediately went to another doctor who granted her disability status as well. Probably for being so mentally ill as to be married to this man. So this, within a literal day of being released from prison, then allowed this pair of sick, child-abusing monsters to now both be eligible for Belgian welfare queen status.
The system works!
And boy, did that title pay well.
I'm gonna keep swinging my baby lasso till I catch me a man.
Just Marc Dutroux alone personally received 80,000 Belgian francs a month from the government in 1992. Today, the equivalent of nearly 2,700 United States dollars every single month. $2,700 every single month for this f***ing pervert. Now, if you're thinking, wow, that convicted child molester was making more than I get paid for my real, actual full-time job to do literally nothing other than pretend to be disabled. Yeah, well, that would have been the exact same reaction of most Belgians, as Marc was literally receiving more money off these government checks than the average Belgian salary at the time.
Wow.
I know I keep saying this, but holy goddamn shit, a convicted child molester was getting paid more than your average working Belgian every single month for doing nothing at all, other than being mentally ill. Apparently, if you go commit a bunch of heinous, disgusting crimes to prove how mentally ill you are, you'll get paid $2,700 a month. It's pretty cool, huh? Dutroux also owned 7 houses, somehow, and even though according to Belgian law, this property should have reduced his ridiculously high welfare checks, it didn't. They just didn't reduce them. The guy's name was on the deeds. He owned the property on record. The law says you have to reduce his pay, and they just didn't do it. Another claim that Marc had made to that prison doctor is that he suffered from insomnia, which led to him immediately, no questions asked, being prescribed Rohypnol, a drug 10 times stronger than Valium, which is also known by another name when used by individuals such as Bill Cosby, roofies.
You boys need anything while you're here?
Some free government roofies.
Just got some
roofies
in from Peru.
Well, it would be rude not to take one or two.
So, just to catch you up here, the Belgian government has now given this literal psychopathic monster a release only 3 years into a sentence given for sexually abusing 5 children, a free monthly paycheck worth more than the average Belgian salary, and an infinitely regenerating supply of free government-issued roofies. And it really makes you wonder whether this was simply the result of incompetence. Getting off to a very strong, rehabilitated start after leaving prison, in September of '93, Dutroux attempted to convince a man that he had met in jail to kidnap 2 girls for him in exchange for 150,000 Belgian francs. That was the man behind the clip that you heard earlier. That man then went to the police and reported Dutroux, a convicted child. Well, you get what I'm saying at this point. A man who they already knew had been found guilty of this exact crime, a thing he had already done 5 times, and they did absolutely nothing about it. They did nothing about this tip at all. Definitely just incompetence. Certainly, right? The next year, Marc and his wife hosted an 18-year-old Slovakian girl who was looking for a place to stay that summer in Belgium. And one night during her stay, Marc used some of his government-issued roofies to knock her out and sexually assault her, a crime that this girl did not even know happened until she saw it herself on a video recording seized by the police years later. And then, in June of 1995, the most widely known reign of terror by the so-called Le Monstre, the Beast of Belgium, Marc Dutroux, would commence. On June 24th, 2 classmates, Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau, left Julie's house to travel to the overpass down the street and wave at the passing cars. Now, if you think that that's kind of a strange thing to do, then clearly your school never organized a trash pickup for its students where they made you go on the side of a highway in spring after all the snow had melted to reveal all the sun-bleached white trash thrown in the ditch by all the sun-bleached white trash that live in Wasilla, Alaska, and then made you use pointy little sticks to pick up cigarette butts and big gulp cups like you were Saul Goodman doing his community service, and the only reprieve you had from this torturous, unpaid, forced child labor that you didn't even commit a crime to earn was to put your hand like this and pull it down like you were operating an invisible train horn every time a semi rolled past to try and get them to honk. Okay, you must have never done that. It's fun. God damn it. Change my mind. You can't. Cancel me if you must. Back at the girl's house, Julie's mother was patiently waiting for the girls to return, but after a while, she started to get pretty concerned. It had only been 15 minutes from the last time the girls had been seen by witnesses on the bridge to the time that Julie's mother started looking for her. But, from what I've already told you, 15 minutes is more than enough for Mark Dutroux to strike. And I don't believe I've mentioned yet that these girls were only 8 years old. Yeah. After talking to the police, who characteristically refused to file a missing persons report until more time had passed that the girls were missing, the mothers contacted an association that helps look for missing children, which soon started a massive missing person poster campaign that plastered the faces of Julie and Melissa all across the country of Belgium. And apparently, if you were anyone living in Belgium in the year of our Lord 1995, you have seen these posters. That's how widespread they were. And please let me know in the comments if you did live through this time. I would be very interested to know your experience. After a telephone hotline was set up for the two girls, tips started coming in. One woman reported seeing two girls get into a dark-haired man's car on the side of a highway. She said they seemed to get in willingly with no signs of a struggle, so she assumed that they must have known the man. Another man who was riding a motorcycle the day the girls went missing reported a red car parked in the emergency lane by the highway. He remembered specifically because the driver had opened the door and he had to swerve out of the way to avoid crashing into it on the highway. 4 more witnesses eventually reported seeing a red car parked in that emergency lane that day, some saying it might have been a red Ford Fiesta. 2 more witnesses reported seeing a van parked further up in the lane as well. And then, the police got their biggest tip yet, when a woman reported that another attempted kidnapping had gone down earlier that very same day that the two girls went missing. The woman said that a man had tried to coax her 8-year-old daughter and her 7-year-old friend into his car with candy, and that in one hand, he was holding a damp rag. You'll see why that's a somewhat incriminating detail later. One of the girls stayed on the street, and one of them actually did get in the car. But thankfully, the mother spotted this, rushed over, and yanked the girl out of the man's passenger seat. The driver attempted to restrain the girl, but the mom rage was just too strong, and he screeched away at full speed soon after the young girl had been pulled from his car. And this woman also formally identified the car as a red Ford Fiesta. And the tempting with candy detail also kind of lines up with the first elderly woman's testimony that the two girls she saw seemed to willingly get into the dark-haired man's car. But for quite some time after this, these were the only details that the police, the families, or the public would get about Julie and Melissa. August 1995. A group of young actors in a theater troupe rented a bungalow on the Belgian coast for a vacation. On August 22nd, 2 girls from this group, Anne Marshall and Effie Yainbrix, 17 and 18 years old respectively, were given free passes to a hypnotist show by some of their friends. The 2 girls boarded a tram and took it down to the larger city where the show was being held. During the show, the hypnotist brought up a group of 80 people to hypnotize, then selected 15 who he deemed heavily susceptible to the hypnosis in order to perform the tricks on for the rest of the audience. Anne and Effie were both picked to be one of said 15 members of the highly susceptible group. After the show had ended, the 2 girls walked out of the main stage, and they were then seen acting very strangely on security camera footage. They were reported to have odd, strangely vacant expressions on their faces. Anne kept her hand contorted in a strange position, and after the show was over, the 2 girls actually started walking in the opposite direction of the tram that they needed to take to get home. This ended up making them miss that train, so they had to end up taking a later one back toward the bungalow. Now, that tram they missed was the only one that went straight from where they were back to the town with the bungalow. So the 2 girls then got to the end of the line with the tram they did take, which was about halfway to their destination, and had to change trains at about 1:20 in the morning. But very unfortunately, they never made it to that next train. After the two girls weren't at the bungalow the next morning, one of their friends called up the parents, who reported them missing to the police, and Anne's father drove down to the beach where they all had been staying. The father went to the room that Anne had been sleeping in and found her stuffed Snoopy doll that Anne had apparently taken with her everywhere since she was a child, complete with a tag offering 100 francs to anyone who would return the doll to her if it ever went missing. And it was this that really made the father realized that something truly awful must have happened to his daughter for her to leave behind such a prized possession. After this, the father then went to the casino the show was held at and saw both the strange behavior in the security footage and a video recording of the show, where his daughter can be seen eating a lemon that she had been told by the hypnotist was a peach without flinching. Really just thought she was eating a peach. The father came to the conclusion that they must not have been woken up properly from their hypnotic state, these two girls. Anne had also been holding this lemon throughout the rest of the show, and when it ended, the lemon was taken away, but her hand stayed in exactly the same position. And this kind of explains the weird lemon-holding shape that Anne was keeping her hand in during the security camera footage that showed the girls walking in the opposite direction of their train after the show. And even if the girls had been woken up properly from the hypnosis is known to make you way more susceptible to suggestion. That's kind of the whole point. So I can see how if you were just hypnotized like 30 minutes ago, it would certainly play a role in making somebody more susceptible to a sketchy situation that might lead to a kidnapping. And once again, for quite some time, this very small amount of info would be all the police, the family, or the public would know about Anne and Effie. On May 28th of 1996, 12-year-old Sabine Dardine hopped on her bike and started off on her normal route to school. She soon turned onto an empty street when she heard the familiar sound of a vehicle approaching from behind. She moved over to the side with her bike to let the car pass, and as it pulled closer, she turned to notice that it was a dirty white van. The side door of the van was already slid open, and as soon as she noticed the man crouched behind it, he had already grabbed her off her bike and yanked her inside. As the driver hit the gas to screech away, the man in the back yelled at him to stop so he could get out and grab the girl's bike. So, sounds like he may have some experience with this situation, snatching a girl off her bike. Experience from December 18th, 1985. For example, experience from like kidnapping children and sexually assaulting them before being let out of prison early after 3 years and being given free money and roofies from the government. Experience kind of like that is what I'm sensing from this whole situation. And speaking of pills, when the kidnapper hopped back inside with the girl's bike and the van once again sped off, he proceeded to pin Sabine down on the filthy van floor and force some small pills into her mouth. And it sounds like those small pills may have had some experience. Some experience being free government roofies issued to a child molester in addition to his monthly check higher than the average Belgian salary. Hard, unearned money that kept him from getting a job and freed up his time to engage in, well, activities such as this, and free government roofies to utilize for, well, activities such as this. And it makes you just wonder, just a little bit, whether this all came about simply as a result of incompetence. Sabine actually managed to spit out these first few roofies, but her attacker saw this and quickly put a funny-smelling wet cloth over her face that made her feel weak and forced her to swallow more pills. The last thing 12-year-old Sabine saw was the dirty, bare mattress in the back of the van where the ripped-out seats used to be, before her attacker wrapped her in a somehow even dirtier blanket covering her face. Somehow still awake back there, despite being chloroformed and having several pills 10 times the strength of Valium thrust into her tiny 12-year-old girl system, Sabine endured the stench of the blanket, the van, and the occupants inside until they finally came to a stop. As the blanket was removed and Sabine could see again, the men then ordered her to get inside a metal toolbox near the back of the van. Sabine refused, but the men forced her inside anyway, and after being carried out of the van and set down, the lid of the box flung open and Sabine stepped out, now finding herself inside of a run-down house just as filthy as the van that had brought her there, grimy, dim, and covered in rubble. an environment reflecting the character of the monsters that stole her. She was led upstairs into a room with boarded up windows, a bunk bed, and a dinosaur poster hanging on the wall. The men then chained her by her neck to the bed and left her there, confused, frightened, and probably just really wishing that she was in the classroom that she had been biking to that morning. Sabine came up with some very fitting titles to give these two men: the driver of the disgusting van that transported her into this grim scenario, she dubbed the Little Nerd, and the man who had snatched her from the bike and drugged her, she called the Greasy Creep. Eventually, after a period of sitting alone, chained to the bed in the dinosaur poster room, the Greasy Creep returned and took Sabine to his bedroom, a room Sabine would later refer to as the Agony Room. There, this fucking disgusting, greasy man stripped Sabine, chained her to the bed, took photos of her, and sexually assaulted her for the first time. This is a much darker subject than I'm used to covering on this channel. This is some heavy stuff. After enduring this traumatizing ordeal, the creep returned Sabine to the dinosaur room, chained her back to the bunk bed, and proceeded to explain to Sabine exactly what was going on here. You see, Sabine's father worked as a police officer, and the creep explained to her that he worked for a very dangerous man, a man he simply referred to as the boss. We'll get into who this boss really is much later, but the creep told Sabine that this boss was very angry at her father, the policeman, and that the boss wanted to make him pay, make him hurt in the worst way that he could imagine, to break a man, to kill his 12-year-old daughter, Sabine. But the creep said that he wasn't going to let that happen, that out of the and kindness of his heart, he was going to protect Sabine from being killed by the boss and keep her there with him where she could be safe. Yes, safe. What a nice guy. Never mind the fact that I just violated you in the most depraved, disgusting way imaginable, literally like 5 minutes ago. Just focus on how nice I am for keeping you safe here, naked and chained to a bunk bed. So safe. The creep went on to tell Sabine that her parents actually knew that all of this was happening. They were fully aware, and that they were thankful to the creep for protecting their daughter, that they didn't want her to be killed by the boss, but they didn't want her to come back home either. Since she'd be in danger with them, they would be in danger with her around, and the creep was the only man who could keep her and her family safe from his evil boss. Now, this story is clearly ridiculous and insane, but to Sabine, this whole situation she now found herself in seemed ridiculous and insane. You know, she didn't know what was happening, and in her frightened, panic state, still drugged up from earlier and having just been traumatized more than she'd ever been in her entire life, her mental state was not really in a place to doubt such a story, and she came to genuinely believe this narrative that her captor had constructed, that this was the only way that she would be safe and keep from being killed, that her family didn't want her anymore, and that this was her life now. The creep, again, just such a nice guy, told her that he wasn't going to force her into any of this, though. She did have a choice in the matter. Not a choice to, leave or anything, but she could choose to stay safe with him, or, if she wanted, he could hand her over to the boss, who he said would, quote, sexually torture her until she died. So, not the best couple of options there. It was a real Sophie's choice situation she was being faced with. Sabine later said of this situation, quote, I can't be sure of the exact wording, but what he offered was a stark choice: live or die. Naturally, I chose to live. Sabine then remained in that dinosaur room for the next 3 days, and on the third day, the creep told her that the house that they were in was actually owned by the evil boss, and he or his lackeys could come by at any moment and discover her there alive. So, in order to keep her safe from the wrath of the boss, he needed to hide her away, and he proceeded to unlock her chains and lead Sabine down to her new home. The creep took Sabine down a narrow, makeshift staircase that had been hastily dug directly into the dirt under the house. This staircase led down to a cellar. Within the cellar, on one of the walls, was a row of metal shelves stocked with packs of water and beer. The creep removed the drinks from the shelf and proceeded proceeded to pry the bottom shelf loose, slide it up on a metal rail, and reveal the brick wall behind it. The creep then removed these loose bricks from the wall to uncover a metal gate. Finally, he opened the gate, which covered up a narrow passageway that led straight into a claustrophobe's worst nightmare. On the other side of this passageway was a hidden chamber that would later be referred to as the dungeon. The dungeon was a cramped 3 feet by 7 foot chamber with a 5 foot ceiling that was painted a very unsettling bright yellow. There were no windows, no natural light, and it was uncomfortably cold and damp. On the floor lie an old spongy mattress and an itchy blanket. Beside it sat a bench, a small shelf on the wall with 2 small lamps, and a bucket. The greasy creep then informed her of all the high-class amenities that he had graciously procured for her in this luxury accommodation, complete with a shopping bag full of snacks and water, an old television with a Sega gaming system, and proudly explained how he, this engineering genius, had even installed a ventilation system for her so she wouldn't suffocate and die. After seeing this poor excuse for a living space and hearing the way that the creep boasted on about the apparent accomplishment of building it, Sabine reportedly turned to him and said, "You've got to be joking." He was not. The creep told Sabine that she had to stay down there, sealed off tight, and that she had to stay quiet. He told her you'd never know if the sounds you were hearing outside the dungeon could be the boss or his goons, and what they would do if they heard you down there and found you alive. The creep, from the other side of the passageway, then closed the gate, sealed the wall back up with brick, lowered the bottom shelf, replaced the drinks, and left Sabine down there, sealed off, alone, and afraid. Sabine still had her backpack that she had taken to school that day, and reportedly kept herself busy and sane by studying her math textbook and writing out all of the terrible things that she was suffering through in her school diary. And what a drastic turn that diary must have taken from the day before writing about having crushes on boys and her teacher being a prick or some shit, and turning the page to her describing this situation. And her studying the math textbook is particularly heartbreaking, given the context of something that went down at home the night before her kidnapping. You see, outside the walls of this dungeon in Mark's home, Sabine's parents were searching desperately for her, just like the parents of the 4 girls that had come before. But the parents and the police could not rule out that there was a possibility Sabine had simply run away. This was because apparently her life at home was not the best, and neither was her relationship with her parents. To top that whole situation off, the night before she had disappeared, her mom had learned of the grade that she had received in her math class that semester, and it was an F. Apparently, Sabine's mom had really chewed her out about this. It wasn't the first time that it had happened, and she reportedly responded by saying something she apparently said quite a lot: "You failed again, Sabine." And I can't imagine the pain and regret that you must have to feel after reprimanding your daughter for failing a class, going to bed angry with her, and waking up the next day to find out that she's gone missing without a trace. And to know that this little 12-year-old girl who thought that her parents didn't even want her back home, that she would die if she ever tried to leave this up situation and go back to them, and in spite of all that, she still took the time in that dungeon to try and improve her math skills to make her mother proud, is just too much, man. I genuinely cried when I went through that part of the story. It really is just so fucking awful. And, it's easy to hear these stories, to put on some true crime shit on YouTube on your way to work or doing chores or trying to fall asleep, and to think that they're simply just that, only stories. But they're not. This all really happened to this poor, brave little 12-year-old girl. This sick that had already been arrested for kidnapping and sexually assaulting 5 girls, one as young as 11, and then been released after 3 years. 3 years full of temporary release visits to his grandmother, and was still getting free money and free roofies from the government, had really, on this planet Earth we live in, done this to this girl, and had been allowed to become the Beast of Belgium and abduct even more poor, innocent kids. Sabine stayed in that dungeon 24/7 until she'd hear the painful sound of scraping metal and brick when the creep would force her out of this narrow passageway and take her to the agony room to sexually assault her repeatedly before being returned to her dark, dank hole in the wall like she was a f***ing hammer that you just grab when you need to hang up a shelf or something before you're done with it and just throw it back in the shed. After a few weeks dragged on like this, Sabine started to grow incredibly homesick. She obviously was not allowed to leave the house or use the phone, and she eventually begged the creep to at least allow her to write a letter to her parents, since, after all, they did know she was there for her own protection, right, according to him. The creep agreed to this, and over the course of her stay, Sabine wrote about 5 or 6 letters to her family, which of course the creep never actually delivered to them. And these letters she wrote contained some of the most heart-wrenching words that I've ever heard. The podcast on Marc Dutroux, Le Monstre, features a powerful segment where they have a girl the same age as Sabine read out a segment from one of these letters.
Dear Mommy, Daddy, Nanny, Sophie, Sebastian, Sam, Tiffy, and all the rest of the family. I asked the man who's keeping me if I could write you again, because Mommy's birthday is approaching and Sophie and Sam's too. I'm so sad I can't wish you a happy birthday and give you a big kiss and maybe even offer you a present. Unfortunately, that's not possible, and if I came home, we'd all be killed, and I don't want that. I'd rather write you from here instead of being at home and dead. The man who's keeping me told me his friend gave Mommy my last letter, and after reading it, you said I should be sure to wash myself well and learn to like what the man does to me, and to be nice to him because if he gets angry with me, he could give me to the bad man, who would hurt me and kill me. By the way, did you eat the radishes? If you want to replant some, there is some seed left in the docker's shoebox in my room. The food I get here is disgusting. There's never any sauce or seasoning. Almost all the food he gives me is expired. He says the expiry date on the label is the sell date. Everything I get is the generic brand, but he drinks real Coke and eats real Nutella. If he has to leave or has visitors, I have to stay locked in the basement, sometimes for several days without any meals. When he left for 5 days, he gave me some expired chocolate from 1993. It tasted old, but I ate it anyways. Hope you're thinking of me. I miss you and adore you all very much.
In parts of these letters, Sabine also describes the horrific things that the creep did to her, the repeated assaults, and her terrible treatment. I personally have not read them. I don't want to read them at all, and I will not describe them, but it's absolutely heartbreaking to know that Sabine was really trying to tell her parents about the terrible, traumatizing things that this man was doing to her, that he would not stop doing to her, that she couldn't try to stop him from doing to her for fear of being killed. And as you heard in that letter, the fact that the man said he delivered all of these letters containing these details of his up torment to her parents, and all he claimed that her parents said in response is that she should wash herself better and should, quote, learn to like what the man does to me. Absolutely sick and depraved. And unfortunately, the depravity was about to get worse. This cycle of solitude within the dungeon and removal for abuse continued on for months, and all the while Sabine was begging the creep to let her go outside, to call someone on the phone, to just be allowed to see another living person, to be allowed to have a friend. August 9th, 1996. 14-year-old Letitia Deliez was hanging out with her friends at a local pool, enjoying a particularly pleasant summer evening. At around 8 p.m., with the late summer sun still shining, she decided to head back on the short walk to her nearby house. On her way home, she passed by a dirty white van parked on the corner of the street. The driver rolled down the window of the van and asked Letitia if there was anything fun happening in town that day. Letitia began telling the driver about out the 24-hour scoot-a-thon before she felt herself be wrapped in a dirty blanket and shoved into the van by another man who had snuck up behind her. This man forced a handful of pills into her mouth and put the bottom of a Fanta bottle over her lips, forcing her to swallow. Letitia then slowly felt herself being less and less able to struggle, her head swimming, before she fell into a pharmaceutical coma, aided by the roofies provided free of charge by the Belgian government. It was the 77th day after Sabine had been ripped from her normal life and forced into the hell that she was enduring with the greasy creep. The creep had been gone from the house for an entire week. Sabine had been locked in the cold, dark dungeon for that whole time, wondering, as she often did when the creep was gone for this long, if she'd ever see outside those bright yellow walls again. When she heard the shelf move up, the bricks come out, and the metal gate swing open. The creep then shouted into the dungeon, "I have a surprise for you!" Sabine's new friend had arrived. The creep took Sabine upstairs to the very same room with the dinosaur poster where she had first been taken after climbing out of the toolbox the day of her kidnapping. Sitting there, chained to the very same bunk bed, was 14-year-old Letitia Deliez, drugged up and assaulted just as Sabine had been 77 days earlier. She had begged the creep for a friend, and he had brought her one. And all Sabine could think, seeing this girl chained to the bed, was, what have I done? Obviously, nothing. She didn't do anything, but that's, she felt guilt about the whole situation, unfortunately. Sabine and her new friend were then brought back down to the dungeon and crammed inside, forced to lie on the thin sponge bed almost on top of each other, made to share the collective 3 feet of space between the two lateral walls. Eventually, the man returned and for once ordered Sabine to stay where she was. He then took Letitia out through the narrow passageway and shut it back up again. Sabine, then, in a horrific, bittersweet way, was relieved that the man had finally come down, and for once, it didn't end with her herself being violated up in the agony room. This relief eventually turned to shame, however. Shame for feeling the relief in the first place, given that she knew exactly what this new girl was enduring at that very moment, just a few flights upstairs above her. The torment then carried on like this for the two girls for the next 4 days, until the creep once again left for about 48 hours. The girls both huddled in the dungeon, scared and cold, when Letitia looked at Sabine and told her that she had seen her before. Letitia told Sabine that she had seen her face on missing posters that had been plastered all around the city. She said that her parents were the one who had put them up there, and that the police were looking all over the place for her. And at this point, after 80 days of captivity, Sabine had become so brainwashed by the narrative that this big bad boss was out to kill her, and that her family was fully aware of this, that she didn't even believe Letitia when she told her this. She didn't believe that there were actually any posters out there with her face on it. She truly did not believe that her family could actually be looking for her. After all, they told her themselves in those letters that she should stay with the creep for her safety and to learn to like what he does to her, right? The day then dragged on, with the girls huddled in the dungeon, hungry, waiting for the creep to return once again, when they heard the familiar sound of a shelf sliding up, bricks pulling out, and a metal gate swinging open. But this time, there was light. A lot of light. The girls were blinded and scared to death by said light and by all the noise and the commotion going on outside. They thought this could be the boss, as the creep had told them so many times, that he had found out that they were down there and that he had finally arrived to kill these two poor girls. They were so scared of what this all might be that they refused to move until they heard the voice of the creep himself say that it was okay. And when their eyes adjusted, they saw that the light was coming from the flashlights of the Gendarmerie, the Belgian FBI. The creep had led these gendarmes, as they're called, directly to the cellar and opened the passageway for them. As the girls exited the dungeon, they were wrapped in blankets and quickly led upstairs. A mob of news crews outside the house filmed the whole thing from every angle live on Belgian TV, for the whole country to see, for them to sigh in relief at the fact that these two girls were finally saved. Yippee, hooray! Among the people witnessing this rescue were the families of the remaining 4 missing girls. 8-year-old Julie and Melissa, who had gone missing more than a year earlier at this point in June of '95, along with 17-year-old Anne and 18-year-old Elfie, who had disappeared 2 months later. For them, this broadcast was a bittersweet sight. 2 young Belgian girls, daughters of parents just like themselves, had just been rescued from the clutches of a monster the world now knew as Marc Dutroux. But at the same time, their own children were still missing, and they couldn't help but wonder, did this man have anything to do with their children as well? Would they also be found inside that house that day? Would they finally find out what had happened to their precious girls? Well, for us to know about those 4 girls, we need to go all the way back to Marc Dutroux's time in prison 4 years earlier in 1992. As you can see, I have switched into my prison hat for levity purposes, because the story is fucking sad, and I want to make use of the many, many hats I have for YouTube videos, so I can use them as tax write-offs. While Marc was locked up in the clink after his first round of crimes, he would often be seen carrying around a chessboard in the hopes of finding someone in the yard to join him for a game.
Kingman.
One of these chess partners was a man named Daniel Dejean, who would later become Marc's cellmate. One day, while the two were locked in their cell, Dutroux proposed an opportunity to Daniel. Dutroux told his cellmate that another prisoner had let him in on the fact that he had constructed a secret bunker under his house to store guns and drugs in. The prisoner had told Marc that a lot of old European houses had large compartments sealed off close to the cellar that used to hold now outdated water systems. This prisoner told Marc that if he could find this old system and bust down that part of the wall leading to it, he could then have a discreet, protected, reinforced secret room that didn't appear anywhere on the house's official floor plan. After telling Daniel all of this, he said he was going to try and build such a room at one of his homes on the outside, and asked him for his help. Now, Daniel was not particularly into this idea, and wondering what would be in it for him, he asked Dutroux, "Why would I help you build that?" Dutroux knew that Daniel had been a drug addict for 20 years and was in prison after being busted while robbing a pharmacy in Belgium, so he replied that Daniel could use said room to hide his stolen drugs. But Daniel also knew why Marc was in prison. And in that point in the conversation, Marc's true motives for this secret chamber clicked in his mind. "You want to build that to hide girls," Daniel declared in disgust. Dutroux did not respond to the accusation, and after an awkward silence hung in the air for some time, the two men eventually moved on to another topic. But 4 years later, on August the 15th, 1996, Daniel Dejean watched on in horror as 12-year-old Sabine and 14-year-old Letitia, naked, scared, wrapped in blankets on live television, walked out of the house of his former cellmate, Marc Dutroux. And he thought to himself, "Oh my God, he actually did it." And we are out of prison. Wasn't that so fun? After his release from prison, Dutroux quickly used the free time granted to him by his disability pay to re-enter the world of crime and make even more money on the side. And this seedy underworld is where he met one Bernard Weinstein. No relation. Well, probably no relation. I guess that would kind of make a bit of sense, given the context of both Weinsteins here, but moving on. Weinstein was a, quote, hardened criminal from France with a very long rap sheet, and he and Marc engaged in various criminal exploits throughout the years, becoming more and more involved with each other until the evening of June 24th, 1995. Now, it is not entirely clear who exactly was the person that actually committed the acts that day, Dutroux, Weinstein, or the two of them together, but I personally think it's most likely that they did do the act together, and at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, as they're both certifiable buckets of shit anyway. What we do know is that one or both of these men did in fact abduct 8-year-old Julie and Melissa that day, and take them back to the very same dungeon that Sabine and Letitia became locked up within a year later. There, Dutroux repeatedly sexually assaulted both girls, just as he had done to the others, even having these acts filmed by his disgusting, complicit wife, Michelle. Then, in the early morning hours of August 23rd, 23rd, Dutroux struck once more. Again, the details of Anne and Effie's abduction are also not entirely clear. It could have been another drive-by kidnapping with the dirty van by Dutroux, Weinstein, or both. There's also a theory revolving around a certain Hotel Brazil, a locality that multiple witnesses reported seeing Anne and Elfie in front of or around on the night of their disappearance. This hotel appeared to be more of a brothel of some kind in reality, and it was run by a man that had already been known to police to be involved with prostitution and sex trafficking, and a known associate of his also owned a red Ford Fiesta that had a plate that closely matched what was reported on the red Ford Fiesta cited on the day of Julie and Melissa's kidnapping. So, a lot of things do add up there to support that theory. But no matter how the specifics played out that night, the two girls did eventually end up in the possession of Dutroux and Weinstein, and were brought to the very same dilapidated house of horrors that held Julie and Melissa. Those two 8-year-old girls were still in the dungeon at the time these two girls were abducted, and there wasn't enough room down there for these monsters to shove 2 additional teenage girls in as well. This was a tiny, cramped, horrible space that you couldn't fit that many people into. So instead, they chained the girls upstairs in the dinosaur room, where they faced the same disgusting assaults and treatment as all of the others. This placement proved to be kind of an issue for Dutroux, however, as these girls were much older and apparently made a few escape attempts, and when one of the girls got loose and tried to make a break for it out of a homemade skylight in the upstairs hallway, the pair of creeps decided they needed to do something about this flight risk. Which, by the way, like, if you're kidnapping girls, don't, for one, but certainly also don't have them next to a homemade janky hole in your ceiling that you're calling a skylight. No. So the pair of creepy monsters then drugged up the girls with government-issued roofies and transported them from Dutroux's to Weinstein's house in another province of Belgium. This house of Weinstein's was actually also owned by Dutroux, and he was simply renting it out to Weinstein under the table at that time. At that house, sometime in September, Dutroux and Weinstein gave the girls more government-issued roofies until they passed out, and the pair started digging. After they were done, they picked up the unconscious Anne and Effie, threw them into the shallow holes that they'd just dug, and then buried them alive. The coroner later found that the cause of death was suffocation from lack of oxygen under the earth. One can only hope that these two girls were still knocked out at the time of their death, dying at least somewhat peacefully, unaware of these horrific circumstances, instead of awakening to find themselves trapped under the earth, unable to breathe. Around this same time, another major event would take place that is admittedly a little bit complicated, so I'll try to lay it out as simply as possible. So at some point, Dutroux, Weinstein, and another man named Philip Divers stole a van and hid it in an airplane hangar. Now, I have no clue at all why they would hide this car here, because literally none of them actually owned this hangar or knew who did. I don't know, maybe that's just where they hid the stolen vehicles that they were known to have jacked in the past. But however it worked out, the owner of this hangar eventually discovered this stolen van, reported it, and the van was then taken away by the police. After discovering that the van was missing, Dutroux and Weinstein suspected that Divers and his friend Pierre Rochaud had somehow betrayed them, leading to the van's capture, so they lured Pierre and Divers into their home, drugged, restrained, and then interrogated them. And I just gotta say, Dutroux is getting a lot of mileage from those free government roofies here. I mean, he has really made some frequent use of those things throughout this story. So Mark and Weinstein then go to Pierre's house, where they find his girlfriend, who they also bring back for interrogation. Then, when Dutroux and Weinstein leave again to go get another suspect, Pierre's girlfriend manages to escape and gets a neighbor to call the police. Again, kind of complicated, but all you really need to know is that they stole a van, and that then led to this lady informing the police, and now the cops are looking for Weinstein. Just Weinstein, for now. I think because the rest of them only knew Weinstein and didn't actually know who Dutroux was. So keep all of that in mind as I described this next crime. Sometime soon after this all happened, in September of '95, Dutrow's wife made a sandwich for Weinstein, who the two were hosting at their home. As Weinstein ate the sandwich, he started to feel a serious carb coma coming on before he soon passed out. The carb coma was roofies in the sandwich. The guy ate a literal roofie sandwich. Is what happened there. Now cut to several days later, and Dutrow was doing some more digging, this time on his own property, where he then dumped the drugged up, unconscious, but still breathing Weinstein into the hole and buried him alive. One can only hope that the sick was not still knocked out at his time of death and experienced a slow, conscious, gasping demise, painfully aware of his horrific circumstances, awaking to find himself trapped under the earth, unable to breathe. But that's probably just wishful thinking. Now, when later questioned about this by police, Dutrow's stated motive for this murder was that he had done it because Weinstein had tried to hurt Julie and Melissa. And I know, a very interesting motive, coming from a guy who was the reason Julie and Melissa were chained up in a dungeon and was repeatedly sexually assaulting both of them on a near daily basis. But okay, sure. Let's hear him out. Here's the statement that he gave police about the events. I brought Weinstein to my home to prevent him from continuing to do stupid things. I crushed up some Rohypnol and added it to his sandwich. He fell asleep, and I took him down to the cellar and explained to Julie and Melissa that Weinstein wanted to kill them. I then took the girls upstairs and told them that they would be sleeping in the bedroom for a while. So I put Weinstein on the bed in the cell and twisted a chain around his neck, secured with a padlock, and attached it to a ring on the wall. I left it long enough for him to reach the toilet bucket in the cell. I then gave him a big dose and took him to his grave. He was still breathing when I buried him. During this confession, Dutrow also told police that it was Weinstein who, acting alone, kidnapped Julie and Melissa and simply brought them to Dutrow to seal up in his underground sexual torture dungeon, which I'm not sure that makes it much better for you, man. And it's also awfully convenient to be blaming the dead guy you personally buried alive for said crimes. But like I said earlier, it doesn't really matter much anyway who did what there, because they're all guilty buckets of shit anyway. So how about the real motive for this murder, though, huh? Because obviously what Dutrow is saying about protecting the girls from Weinstein was a complete crock of shit. The real motive was that the police were after Weinstein after the van incident, and Dutrow didn't want him getting pinched and then ratting him out, so he killed him. And some more details provided by Mark's wife Michelle that Dutrow had conveniently left out of that statement to police also might shed some light on another reason for the murder. This is what Michelle told police. Mark asked me to prepare sandwiches to put Bernard Weinstein to sleep. He wanted to steal 500,000 francs that Bernard had received from his mother to buy her house. Afterward, Mark told me that to make Weinstein confess to where he had hidden his money, we had to finally use torture. He used clamps placed around his testicles, and Weinstein finally confessed where his money was. That's right, Mark literally put Weinstein's balls in a vice to get him to cough up the cash. And Mark had used hose fasteners for this purpose here. They're those little metal things, kind of like a zip tie that you can use to keep a hose in a loop. It's not important, but necessary information nonetheless. But even though Weinstein was out of the picture, Dutrow wasn't in the clear for this van theft just yet. 3 months later, in December of 1995, Dutrow was spotted by Pierre Diver's friend, one of the men that he and Weinstein had tied up and interrogated, and was then ratted out to the police. Dutrow was then arrested and sent to prison for the theft of the van on December 5th. Now, at this time, those two 8-year-old girls were still locked up in that terrible, dark, dank dungeon, and at the time of Dutrow's arrest, they had been there for more than 5 months, more than 160 days. That's twice as long as Sabrine would be locked up with Dutrow, the greasy creep, before she was freed along with Letitia. And now, even though Dutrow was going to prison for the van theft, unfortunately, the two girls' torment was still not going to end there. Dutrow's wife, Michelle, was still living at the house that the two girls were imprisoned under, and Dutrow had ordered her to take care of the girls, to give them food, water, and other necessities until he returned from prison. But this fucking evil bitch just didn't. She just didn't do that, later claiming that she was, quote, too afraid to go in the dungeon. Yeah, this fucking sorry excuse for a dumpster fire that was this woman was too afraid to feed the two 8-year-old girls, 9-year-old girls, possibly even by this point. They might have had their birthdays in a evil pervert's goddamn PDF file dungeon. She was too afraid to take care of two precious innocent young girls that her evil husband had abducted, who were slowly starving in a locked vault under her feet. She was too afraid to actually do, I don't know, the right goddamn thing, the moral thing that any normal human being not possessed by Satan would do in this situation, with their captor being locked up in prison, and call the police to get them out, or at the very goddamn least, open the hatch, blindfold them, put them in your car, and drop them off at a hospital at 1 a.m. or something. But no, she was too afraid to do any of that, and instead, she just did nothing. Nothing at all. And by the time that Mark was released on the 20th of March, 1996, almost 4 months later, he opened the vault to find two tiny corpses that had starved to death in the bright yellow room from hell. He later buried these two poor girls on his property, very close to the same spot that he'd buried Weinstein several months earlier. And obviously, with his dungeon now empty, Mark had to go and fill it again. Which brings us to 1 month later, on May 28th, 1996, with the kidnapping of 12-year-old Sabine Dardine. And you know what happens from there. The day Mark Dutroux took his van out to the pool in order to find Sabine, her new friend Letitia, was the beginning of his downfall. After Letitia didn't come home from the pool, police were called, and unlike the previous 5 girls, they seemed to actually kind of have their shit relatively together this time, for some strange, inexplicable reason. Maybe it was because 6 girls had now gone missing in less than a year, and they'd found none of them. Maybe it was because they just have more to work with this time, honestly. But regardless of the reason, the police began interviewing witnesses at the pool immediately, and it appeared that on that day, Mark had been a bit sloppy. The police talked to a nun, Sister Etline, who said that she had seen a big, clunky van with stickers covering the rear windows by the pool that evening. They also talked to Letitia's friend Kathy, who said that she'd seen a man who she didn't recognize come into the pool to use the restroom, and that her boyfriend Benoit had seen him too. So the police then interviewed Benoit, who said that he had seen the guy, but didn't remember anything about his appearance. But when the police asked about a van, Benoit did say that he also saw a beat-up white van with stickers covering the rear window parked across the street from the pool. In fact, Benoit seemed to have paid quite a bit of attention to this van and have quite a good memory, because he was able to give police the make, model, and the first 3 numbers of the license plate for the van, which, big W from Benoit right there. What are the chances of that? But I mean, you know, when you go parking a giant, dirty, white, loud-ass, literal pedo van in full view of a public pool with children in broad daylight, it might cause some people to pay some close attention, right? Especially when everyone in the goddamn country knows that there's someone out there snatching young girls, you know?
The only thing missing on that car was just the Mark Dutroux, kidnapper of children.
Benoit said that he had actively paid some extra attention to the vehicle because he was worried that whoever was inside this, quote, junky van might try to steal his bicycle. So now, with this kid and the nun both separately making a point of mentioning a suspicious van, and with the big brain Benoit over here memorizing the make, model, and half a license plate, the cops finally had a real lead to follow up on in one of these all too common disappearances of young girls in Belgium. Well, saying that they finally had a lead is a bit misleading, but well, you'll see what I mean in a moment with that. After running all of the plates on that make of van that started with the letters FRR, the police came back with 77 matching vehicles. But after narrowing the search for the matching model, the search came back with only 1 vehicle, a van registered to a man named Mark Dutroux. I love to see it. I love to see this. After looking into Dutroux, the investigators found that this man had already been under surveillance by the Gendarmerie, which is basically the Belgian FBI, FBI for almost an entire year. And I know that sounds interesting, that the Belgian FBI had been surveilling this man for an entire year, given everything that had happened in, that entire year. And don't worry, we'll get into that in a little bit. There's quite a lot to say about that. But for now, let's stick with the local police, who are just now finding out about the owner of this van, Marc Dutroux. The investigators set up a meeting with the gendarmes, as they're called, to learn more about Dutroux and their surveillance operation. The gendarmes brought the investigators quite a goddamn large file on Dutroux and said that they had a lot of suspicions about him, informing the investigators of his previous 13-year sentence for the kidnapping of 5 girls in 1989. The gendarmes even told the police that they knew Marc had even solicited help from other individuals to help abduct young girls and lock them up in a secret hiding place that he was building in his home. You may remember someone reporting that exact thing to police before any of the new string of kidnappings occurred after Marc's release from prison. So these gendarmes knew that Marc had already gone to jail for abducting and sexually assaulting minors, that he'd asked someone to help him abduct and imprison minors, and even the detail that he was building a secret hidden dungeon of some kind in his home, and they'd had him under surveillance for an entire year at that point. And during that year, he'd still managed to abduct 4 more girls after they had already started surveilling him, and the actual local police knew literally none of this until this very moment, after 6 girls had gone missing, and the moment that they themselves finally had a lead to look into unrelated to the gendarmerie. Yeah, so if that's making you once again ponder the simply incompetence question, just you wait, buddy. Just you f***ing wait. Just a moment. The file the gendarmes gave police also contained a section naming possible accomplices of Dutroux, including his wife Michelle, Bernard Weinstein, and another man who has a name that is hard to pronounce. It's difficult. It's something like Michael Yevry, but we'll later find out that he was who the little girl would call the little nerd. So we're just gonna call him that because I cannot speak Dutch, or it's not Belgian, I know that, it's one of the other languages. The little nerd was a strung-out drug addict who was acting as Dutroux's new lackey henchman, and he was the one who was driving the van the morning that Letitia was kidnapped. The police quickly set up surveillance of all of Dutroux's 7 properties, and noticed that parked outside of one of them sat the very same dirty, beat-up van covered in stickers with the license plate starting in FRR. The next morning, the cops rushed into that property, finding 39-year-old Marc Dutroux, his 36-year-old wife, and the 25-year-old little nerd, and finally put all of the trio in cuffs and brought them in for questioning. A few hours later, one interrogation team actually ended up releasing the little nerd, telling the other investigators that they didn't think that he'd done anything wrong. Excellent police work, I know. You're gonna see a lot of that. Soon after that, the cops got some testimony from neighbors of Marc who said that they had seen an olive-skinned man named Michael arriving home with Dutroux, driving the same beat-up van the very same night that Letitia had gone missing. The leading investigator then asked the team that had just released the little nerd, "Who's this olive-skinned Michael?" And they then told him, well, that's Michael Lelievre, or whatever his last name is, and he angrily responded, quote, "Well, he just f***ed off out the door." This should give you a bit of context for how well this thing was being conducted here. The police then hunted down the little nerd once again and caught him an hour later at the train station attempting to flee to Slovakia, which always makes somebody look incredibly innocent, right? When you're rearrested twice in one day, literally waiting for a train to arrive, which you will use to flee to Slovakia. Always an incredibly good look there. Dutroux, meanwhile, was interrogated for a total of 8 hours until 3 a.m., but just like in his previous crimes, admitted nothing. After the recapture of the little nerd, on the other hand, by the time the police got to questioning him again, he had apparently started going through the initial stages of heroin withdrawal, and became, well, a much easier suspect to work with after that, and it was there, sweating, itchy, and probably needing to take the biggest opioid withdrawal-induced diarrhea shit of his entire life, that the little nerd admitted to abducting 14-year-old Letitia Deliez with Marc Dutroux. This then gave police cause to hold their suspects for longer than the initial 24-hour period that they have to do so under Belgian law, and the police, now armed with this confession, brought in another interrogator to try and crack Marc Dutroux. After another grueling round of interrogation that lasted until 4 a.m. the next day this time, the investigator had told Marc that multiple witnesses had seen his van at the very same pool that Letitia disappeared from, and faced with this information, here is the statement that they managed to pry out of Marc Dutroux. Marc told the police, quote, "I saw a cute girl. She was wearing a skimpy summer outfit." I want to throw up. I don't want to read this. I want to throw up. I don't want to read this and I want to throw up. "I saw a cute girl. She was wearing a skimpy summer outfit, and when she passed by, I said hello. She was interested in my van, and I told her to jump in, and she sat down next to me. We chatted a bit, and I asked her age, and she said she was 15 years old or something like that. She said she was fed up and had family problems. I could see she was open and easy. She wasn't afraid. I want to throw up. I want to vomit." He didn't say that. I'm saying that. I want to vomit. I'm nauseous. "When I found out her age, I was disappointed and decided I didn't want to have any trouble, and then she left." Now, I don't know why Marc would feel compelled to tell the police, who were investigating him, a known kidnapper and sexual abuser of children, for kidnapping a child, that this 15-year-old girl was wearing a skimpy summer outfit and was open and easy. Actually nauseous. I guess the guy just couldn't turn the creep off, even while sitting in an interrogation room in front of the goddamn police. But as you can see from that statement, Marc admitted here to being at the pool that evening, meeting a cute, open and easy 15-year-old girl, gross, and her even getting into his van. But he said that she had left and that he in fact did not, kidnap and imprison her in a hidden underground dungeon. Eventually, though, after hours of intense pressure from the investigators, who were using some psychological tactics to try and appeal to Marc's clear sociopathic, narcissistic pride, got him to admit that he had not only kidnapped one girl, but two. Like, that was something to be proud of. He like a real big flex on the police, he was saying it was. This led to Marc taking the police and gendarmes directly to his hidden dungeon in the rescue of the two poor, frightened girls, Sabine and Letitia, that I told you about earlier. And after this rescue, the country of Belgium rejoiced. They spontaneously assembled a giant bonfire to burn all of the missing persons posters for Letitia that were still waiting to be put up around the nation. There were good vibes. There were good vibes after this rescue. For a very, very short, brief period of time, there were good vibes. And during his interrogation, Dutroux had also made a bit of a very impactful Freudian slip. When asked why he had kidnapped Letitia, he said that he wanted to bring a friend for Sabine, and that she had personally asked him to go and get her Julie Lejeune. Now, what he meant to say there was Letitia Deliez, the sixth kidnapped girl, but he accidentally said Julie Lejeune, one of the first two initial 8-year-old girls that Marc had first kidnapped in June of '95. Now, pretty much everyone already had the possibility that Dutroux may have been behind these other kidnappings in their minds, but this little slip-up made the police push him hard about Julie and Melissa until he eventually cracked on that too, telling them not he, of course, but Weinstein and the little nerd Yevre had kidnapped the two girls and brought them to Marc, where he imprisoned them in the very same dungeon that they had just rescued Sabine and Letitia from. He also said that the two girls were currently at that property, without specifying their, state, which, after the rescue of Sabine and Letitia, really got the hopes up for investigators and the families of these girls, until, of course, they arrived at the property and Dutroux gestured directly to the ground. The police then excavated the area and eventually dug up two tiny bodies. and the family was devastated. During the excavation, they also found Weinstein buried nearby, and with this discovery, it then led to Dutroux confessing to that murder as well, and several weeks later, after finding out who Weinstein was and where he lived, it also led police to begin digging on the property that Weinstein had rented from Dutroux, where they very unfortunately found Anne and Effie buried there as well. So, all of the relief that the country was feeling after the rescue of Sabine and Letitia incredibly quickly turned to sorrow at the discovery of these 4 dead girls. And then, as the public found out that Dutroux had already been arrested for pretty much these exact same crimes years earlier, and released so disgustingly early at that, their sadness then quickly turned to anger. Anger at the incompetence of police and the judicial system that allowed this monster, this clear psychopath, to get back on the streets and strike again with 6 more girls. The only 2 officials that were safe from this wave of public resentment were King's prosecutor Michael Bourlet and investigating judge Mark Connerat, who both joined the case after the final kidnapping of Letitia that brought Marc Dutroux to his arrest just 6 days later due to their quick and decisive police work. And the public subsequently held these 2 men up as symbols of hope and justice for the Belgian judicial system. Belgian judicial system is a hard thing to say. Say that 10 times fast. It's difficult. Bourlet and Connerat quickly began getting a team together to begin investigating Dutroux's 6 kidnappings in the context of a much wider child trafficking network, focusing heavily on a Belgian businessman with some serious ties to politicians and people in powerful places in Europe named Michael Nuchol, also known as Jean-Michel. I don't know why literally everyone in Belgium appears to be named Michel or Michael or however you say that. I know it's confusing, but hey, I cannot control what they do over there. They like Michaels, I guess. It's like Michael or Muhammad. It's a good name. And can I just say that this man, Nuchol, definitely looks the part. That is the slimiest man. End of sentence. That guy looks like he just crawled out from under a moss-covered rock and proceeded to lick his eyeball with his own tongue. He looks disgusting, and he is, as we will see. Now, the police had actually already arrested Nuchol on August 16th, a day after the rescue of Sabine and Letitia, for his discovered connections to Marc Dutroux. These connections included the fact that shortly before the kidnapping of Letitia, phone records showed no less than 30 calls between Dutroux, Nuchol, and the little nerd. And a day after the kidnapping, Nuchol gave Dutroux $15,000 worth of ecstasy pills. Coincidence?
I think not!
That's a lot of ecstasy pills, by the way. He gave them, it was literally 1,000 pounds of ecstasy. It was like a literal ton of ecstasy pills. I don't think you just go doing that for no particular reason. In addition, when police talked to Letitia after her rescue, she told them that after waking up from her drug-induced coma, one of the first things that she remembered clearly was hearing a phone call where Marc was talking to a, quote, Jean-Michel, and telling him that it had all, quote, worked out. The little nerd also told police during questioning that Dutroux and Nuchol were both trying to convince him to join a much larger child trafficking network. In even more addition, Nuchol also had ties to Hotel Brazil, the suspected brothel run by that guy who was known to be involved in prostitution and human trafficking, if you remember that bit from when we were talking about the kidnapping of Anne and Effie. Then, the darkest piece of evidence came out against Nuchol when a woman came forward to police and told them that she had been a victim of sex trafficking as a child. So this whole investigation into Dutroux's crimes in the context of a wider child sex trafficking network involved victim witnesses, victims of the network, who also acted as witnesses for the police, and they called those people the X-witnesses. We'll talk about that more a bit later, but one woman, Regina Louf, was the first woman of these so-called X-witnesses, codenamed X1. They didn't make their names public, which is the reason for the X thing, and Regina Louf came forward to police and told them that she had been a victim of sex trafficking as a child. She told them that during that experience, she had seen Marc Dutroux in attendance at child sex parties that were held by none other than one Jean-Michel Nuchol. parties where the woman claimed that children were sexually abused and tortured, and where she witnessed at least one of these kids die from this treatment at the hands of these sick, inhuman freaks. So, do you see how this whole thing is starting to sound a bit Epstein-y here? I kind of understand the whole powerful people are reptilians conspiracy sometimes when I hear shit like this, because what warm-blooded human would ever be able to do that, let alone fucking enjoy it? You know, they're just not people, man. They're the monsters under all of our collective beds. And as you'll see, our figurative parents are not very interested in checking under there for us. So, as I just said, Brulé and Connerotte, the two fellows held up as the symbol of hope for the Belgian justice system by the nation's citizens, are now investigating Dutroux crimes in connection to a much larger child trafficking network, with this man, Michel Nahul, the powerful, corrupt businessman with high-level political connections, at its center.
And then funniest thing happened.
Brulé and Connerotte were invited to a potluck spaghetti dinner held by the incredibly thankful family of Letitia and other members of the community to celebrate the rescue of these two little girls, where the two men, get this, ate spaghetti. Spaghetti! Scandalous, I know. At least, that's certainly what the Belgian government seemed to think, as after pictures of the potluck got out featuring Brulé and Connerotte chowing down on the stringy Italian delicacy, Dutroux' defense attorney claimed that this clearly showed that the two men were not impartial on this case, as they were accepting gifts, bribes, you could even say, in the form of the plate of spaghetti that the two men ate, a fountain pen worth 27 euros, and a bouquet of flowers for their wives given to them by the family of a young girl these two men rescued from a literal dungeon. This led to what the Belgian public referred to as the, quote, spaghetti arrest, where the court decided that yes, these men eating spaghetti was indeed grounds enough to remove investigating Judge Jean-Marc Connerotte, one of the only two men in the whole affair that the Belgian public saw as anywhere near competent and trustworthy, from the case. And to top it all off, the new investigating magistrate they put on the case had literally never done the job before. He was fresh off the block, just picked somebody off the fucking street. I mean, they didn't just do that, as we'll again see, but he hadn't done this before. So now the biggest case in Belgium was now this Schlemiel's first case in Belgium, or anywhere for that matter. And the population of Belgium was not happy.
I'm not happy, Bob. Not happy.
They, as they had brains and eyes, saw this move as a thinly veiled ploy to suppress a man who was investigating Belgian politicians and the nation's rich and powerful for their connections to a child sex ring. And the Belgian people were not just going to sit on their ass and take it this time. This was the last straw. 5 days after Connerotte was removed from the case, on October 20th, 1996, roughly 400,000 Belgians, over 3% of the entire country's population, turned up at the nation's capital to protest the dismissal of Connerotte. Hordes of people marched into the streets, holding up signs calling the decision ridiculous. 3,000 Hell's Angels revved their engines at the Capitol in a rage. Even the city's firemen turned up with their trucks and hosed down the Capitol building, representing the need to wash out the dirty, corrupt government dealings that led to 6 of their nation's children being kidnapped, abused, and 4 of them being killed. And like I said, this was a whopping 3% of the entire country that showed up here. For an equivalent in America, this would be like if 10 million people all showed up to protest a judge being removed from a court case. This display of national outrage came to be known as the White March. And as we shall soon see, this Belgian outrage at the sheer ineptitude and incompetence of police and the judiciary to stop this monster from taking their kids was much more justified than the citizens could have ever known at that time. And to find out why, we need to finally talk a bit about that Belgian FBI I mentioned, the Gendarmerie. And I'm just gonna warn you, you're going to get mad. I'm going to get mad. Everyone's gonna get really pissed off at this next part, okay? Now, the gendarmerie in Belgium at this time was a separate force from the rest of the country's local police. They were basically like two independent police forces working around each other, all right? It was that way until this case. This case alone made it so that that isn't the case anymore, and we will see why. Just 2 weeks after the first kidnappings of 8-year-old Julie and Melissa, the gendarmes sent a fax out to their head office calling out Marc Dutroux as a very likely suspect for the abduction, pointing to his previous conviction for basically the exact same crimes as evidence. So they were already looking at this guy just 2 weeks after the first abduction, way before 4 more girls would eventually be snatched by him. During this time, they received those tips that Marc Dutroux was building or had built a secret prison room in his home, and even received multiple tips from separate informants saying Dutroux might be involved with the kidnapping of Julie and Melissa. Now, as the host of the Le Monstre podcast points out, this is exactly where it all should have ended. Any investigating judge in Belgium, faced with this evidence, would have issued a warrant to at least search Dutroux's house, where they could have rescued the girls alive and prevented the terrible crimes Marc would inflict on 4 more victims. But that did not happen. No, that did not happen at all, despite the massive amount of evidence linking Dutroux to the abduction. And it makes you wonder whether this could ever, in any reasonable way, simply be the result of incompetence. Well, in at least one aspect, that's kind of proven to not be the case, since the gendarmes themselves stated a very clear reason for not getting this warrant and immediately putting an end to this monster's reign of terror. This is because to get the warrant, the gendarmes would be required to inform a judge of this information, which would mean looping in the actual local police. Since this stuff is legally their jurisdiction, the police would then conduct the search of the house, save the girls, and apparently, in the mind of the gendarmes, get all the credit for their rescue. And so, apparently, to the gendarmes, the public, thinking that they did all the work and their big fat dick was way bigger and fatter than all those stinky local police, was much more important than saving 2 8-year-old girls that they knew at that very moment were being imprisoned and sexually tortured by a psychopath who could kill them at literally any second. And did do that. So just chew on that information, just consume that, process that shit for a second before it gets even more insane. Now, at this point, I'm quite familiar with the CIA, right? I've had to do mountains of research on their terrible, ridiculous crimes against humanity for this channel. And even though I haven't mentioned them at all for like this entire video at this point, don't forget this whole affair is technically one entry to a CIA iceberg that I'm covering, and we will be talking about them at the end, all right? But I bring this up because this Belgian FBI, the gendarmes, as we will see, at some points sound a lot like the brutally bare-faced stupidity, willful ignorance, sheer dick-measuring pride, and the drive to protect the rich and powerful at any given cost that we often see from the Central Intelligence Agency. Oh, this shit isn't even on, is it? How long has that been off? Is it dead? Ooh. Well, I don't have time to charge this up, so you saw what was on it. I'll turn it on later. So instead of getting a warrant and informing the local police, who according to Belgian law should have been the ones who had jurisdiction here, in other words, instead of doing their goddamn jobs, these gendarmes instead held a meeting where, again, instead of following the Belgian law that requires meetings like this to be recorded, they just didn't follow that law at all and recorded none of it. In this meeting, the gendarmes plotted on how they were going to handle this case without informing the local police, how they could finagle their way around the law so that they could get all the credit. Or possibly to discuss how to ignore the case and actively hide the evidence from the police for a much darker, sinister purpose. Because, I mean, how would we ever actually know? Because they illegally never recorded the goddamn meeting, so we have no idea what it is that they really said. And if you're coming out after the fact to say that your illegally unrecorded meeting was about illegally not sharing evidence with local police, if you're admitting that that is what it was, just imagine how bad that meeting could have actually been in order for them to cover their ass by saying that shit, you know? I think this way mostly because if they really wanted to actually, you know, save the girls, show up the local police for no reason, and look like heroes, they could have, hear me out, at that point, they could have, this is crazy, saved the girls, showed up the local police, and looked like heroes by charging into the house themselves and rescuing them from a literal dungeon that they knew Dutroux had built. But instead, they did not do that. Even though they totally could have done that, they did not do that. And it makes you just think how, you know, this could be the result of simple incompetence. Can people even be that stupid?
You are stupid. Yes, you stupid. Unequivocally.
Survey says no.
What do you think you be doing on Saturday night? The two guys next to me. We asked 100 women. Feet.
Instead, the gendarmes, taking a page straight out of the CIA playbook, set up a secret, useless surveillance operation of Dutroux that they called Operation Othello. Even sounds like a CIA. You told me Operation Othello? I'd think the CIA did that. The main reason that this surveillance operation was completely useless is that the gendarmes only surveilled Mark during daylight hours. Literally. They even had like cameras set up facing his house that they had on from 8 a.m. to like 6 p.m. and then they turned them off for the nighttime. As soon as the sun went down, what's he gonna do? Kidnap girls at night? Ludicrous. Idiotic idea. No, never. It's just not possible. Now, I'll just spoil this a bit and say that there is evidence that the gendarmes were actively covering something up here. So, knowing that, I think personally that this whole surveillance operation was just an excuse to not actually stop Mark from doing what he was doing. It was to create a term that the CIA literally invented known as plausible deniability. Because if it got out that the gendarmes actually knew all of this shit that they did about Mark Dutroux and did, you know, literally nothing, that would be insane. I mean, this is already insane, but it would be even insanier and suspicious and probably illegal. So instead of doing literally nothing, they just kind of cleverly, if this was the goal, decided to do effectively nothing by, on the books, having a full-on surveillance operation of their suspect, but instead just looking at him whenever they felt like it, as long as it didn't get in the way of hitting that 5 p.m. happy hour with the boys. Because if they actually wanted to do something, again, they would have f***ing done something, all right? They would have rushed in there and saved 2 8-year-old girls from being repeatedly abused by a psychopath, but they didn't. And that's proof enough of some kind of shit floating around in the stew to me, okay? It's all incredibly sus. And to make it even more sus, it's not like these girls were in the dungeon 24/7. You know, Dutroux would take them up to the agony room or even to his dinner table to eat with them often. And when Anne and Effie were brought in, they didn't even stay in the dungeon. They were just in that upstairs dinosaur room, which, to be fair, Sabine did mention that that room had its windows boarded up, so maybe all of Dutroux's windows were boarded up, so the gendarmes couldn't actually see the girls just sitting at the dinner table, clearly in Dutroux's possession during daylight hours. But they could have at least put some fucking audio bugs in there if they actually wanted to do anything. You know, they're already recording video of possibly nothing but a boarded up house. Why not put audio in there too? They could have heard the girls, rushed in there and saved them, but instead they just didn't do that. They just did this useless, complete fucking sham of an operation that served literally no purpose. And then, a couple of weeks after they started this useless nonsense surveillance operation, on the 4th of September 1996, Mark Dutroux's own mother, you'll remember she wrote the prison begging them not to release her son, once again reached out to try and protect the world from the absolute psycho that was her baby boy. Dutroux's mother told the authorities, I am not making this shit up, that Mark's neighbors had told her that young girls were being brought in and out of Mark's house at night, and that they were concerned about the noises that they were hearing from Dutroux's house, and Mark's own mother even told the police verbatim that Dutroux, her son, was, quote, keeping 2 girls in a cage. I don't know how much more on the nose you can get there, guys. And they didn't even step 1 foot inside his house at that point. You know, they're monsters too after that, really. But then comes the worst blunder from the gendarmes most likely ever. If you'll recall from earlier, Dutroux was arrested in December of 95 for the theft of that van and was forced to leave the property, as going to jail often forces one to do, and therefore to leave Julie and Melissa, who at this point had been in his clutches under the nose of the gendarmerie surveillance for months now in his dark, damp, unheated dungeon in the middle of the frosty Belgian winter. But at this point, with Mark being gone, the gendarmes actually did take an opportunity to do something they should have done, I don't know, like 7 months ago, and finally enter Mark Dutroux's house. But if they entered Dutroux's house in December of 95, I hear you saying, while doing math in your head, why didn't he get arrested for kidnapping the girls for another 9 months? Well, you are about to goddamn see, my friend. On December 13th, 1995, 3 gendarmes rolled up to Mark Dutroux's front door with a locksmith. Now, this search was, technically speaking, on the books, supposed to be linked to the case of vehicle theft that Mark was arrested for, which was handled by the local police, and therefore this search should have also been handled by the local police. And if it had, well, maybe Mark Dutroux wouldn't have not been arrested for another 9 months, but the gendarmerie, for some inexplicable reason, usurped the warrant from the local police and entered the home themselves. Now, was this because of their official narrative of them wanting to get all the credit and flex their big ol' gendarme dicks on the local police by saving the girls instead of them? Well, I know I keep saying this, but the fact that Dutroux wasn't arrested for the kidnappings for another 9 months, personally, to me, would probably say otherwise. Maybe the gendarmes, who, you know, knew that there were girls in there and that Mark was guilty based on a heaping Everest-sized mountain of evidence, intentionally stole the search from the local police, specifically so that they wouldn't find the girls, since, you know, that kind of seems like what they've been doing literally this entire time by hoarding all this evidence to themselves and not sharing it with literally anyone. I'm just saying. I'm just positing a theory there. So the locksmith cracks open the door, and he, along with the 3 gendarmes, enter Mark Dutroux's rundown home. The head gendarme sends his 2 men upstairs to see what they could find, while he headed down to the basement with the locksmith. Now, at this point, Anne and Effie had very unfortunately been buried alive 3 months earlier, so they weren't upstairs anymore. And, you know, is it possible that Mark managed to clear up all the evidence that they were ever there? Yes. Did he do that? No, as the gendarmes did find several items of interest up there, including chloroform, which already such a red flag, Jesus Christ. They also found other sedatives, vaginal ointment, a speculum used by gynecologists for vaginal inspections, and most importantly, 13 separate videotapes, at least 13 that they'll admit to finding. I think that there was likely more, but we'll get into that. Meanwhile, the head gendarme and the locksmith were heading straight for the basement, where 2 naked, scared, starving 8-year-old girls were locked up literally just a few feet away on the other side of the shelf. And when they reached the basement, that should have been made very obvious. This is because as soon as they got down there, the locksmith told the head gendarme that he heard voices, and not like in a schizophrenic sense. He said that he was currently hearing what sounded like the voices of children. And keep in mind, he didn't even know why the hell the gendarmes were actually there. He was just a locksmith. You know, at the very most, if anyone had even bothered to tell him why they were there, it would have been to search the home of a car thief, not a man suspected of imprisoning 2 girls in his secret dungeon located in his basement that they were in, that the head gendarme with him down there knew all too well, as they were told that by multiple individuals, including Dutroux's own goddamn mother. So the locksmith tells the leader that he hears children's voices, and the leader says that he hears them too. And the leader then yells at his team upstairs very loudly, as he's trying to yell from the basement all the way through 2 flights of a house to, quote, "Shut up!" And after the head gendarme screams, "Shut up!" at his team upstairs, the voices stopped, and even the locksmith couldn't hear them anymore. Now, why? Why would you yell that? You could already hear the voices. And how much noise could the team upstairs really be making? They're separated by 2 layers of floor. So now this leader, who knew from so much evidence that there were in fact children in that house in a f***ing secret compartment in the basement, hears voices of children along with another man in the basement, screams the words, "Shut up," the voices stop, and then they just let it go. Seriously, I'm not kidding. The leader was just like, "Oh, those voices of children we just heard from the basement of a guy who we think is keeping children in his basement must have been nothing, man. No need to concern yourself with that. This dude is just a car thief, as far as you know. After all, literally no need to look into that any further." The leader told the locksmith that he must have heard voices of children, quote, "playing outside or something." And then the locksmith, again, thinking he's just in the house of either a random guy or a car thief, insists that he heard the voices of little children coming from that basement, not outside, from that basement. And after he tells the head gendarme this, he looks back at the locksmith and angrily snaps, saying, "Who's the cop here, you or me?" And after that, they just left. They just left the house of a man they heavily suspected was holding 2 kidnapped 8-year-old girls in a secret dungeon under his house after hearing the voices of children under his house. Oh, and by the way, the head gendarme leading this search was not, fired or reprimanded in any way for this, and in fact was later promoted. When later questioned under oath during the trial, the locksmith said about this, quote, "I don't know a single person who would have left the basement after what we heard if they knew that they were searching for little girls. I cannot conceive how they could stop searching after hearing such clear voices." But this locksmith apparently failed to realize that these were not people. They were monsters. Monsters who, at the very best, like giving them so much credit, an inconceivable amount of credit, were the most stupid, irresponsible, uncaring individuals in the world. And in a worse case that I personally find much more likely, were actively covering up the voices, making excuses, and choosing to leave those little girls locked up down there alone to starve. And as far as him yelling "shut up," we already know that Marc Dutroux had told Sabrine and Letitia that there was a big boss that wanted to kill them that might be there at any moment, right? And to keep quiet for that situation. So you'd assume that he told these little girls that as well. So they would just hear something, be pleading for their lives, plausibly, and that's what the locksmith heard. So then the guy just angrily yells "shut up," and they probably just got so scared that they just shut up and pretended like they weren't there. And then, knowing that they were there, they just left. And you won't believe me, but it somehow gets even worse. Now, I mentioned all the other suspicious evidence like the chloroform and videotapes that the gendarmes found there, which they conveniently took with them outside the house. Now, if the gendarmes had not stolen the warrant from the local police, and it was them who searched the house like they were legally supposed to, it would have been them who found the chloroform, the weird vaginally related items, and most crucially, the videotapes. But no, the gendarmes did take the warrant, so it was them who took all those items out of Dutroux's house. Almost like they were trying to, remove evidence from the scene of a crime in case somebody else went in there later. And on the subject of the video, here's just a few things that were contained on those tapes that were seized by the gendarmes. Footage from a TV show covering the abduction of Julie and Melissa, footage of Dutroux building the dungeon and explaining proudly exactly what he planned to do with it, which would have showed the police exactly where the secret room was, and finally, multiple tapes of Dutroux sexually assaulting minors, including one literally labeled Julie and Melissa. On the label of the tape, it was labeled Julie and Melissa on the outside of the goddamn tape. I am getting so frustrated here because, this is so clearly a fucking cover-up, right? Especially because the police claimed after taking the tapes that nobody even bothered to watch them until 1999, 3 years after Dutroux was arrested. And they even returned several of these tapes back to Dutroux after he was released from prison for the car theft in March of 1996, including the tape labeled Julie and Melissa. And as the host of Le Monstre says at this point, is this level of incompetence even possible? And no, The answer to that question is no. He didn't say it, but I will. No. This does not make you wonder whether this was simply incompetence. This makes you know for a fact that it was not, allegedly. Because, I'm sorry, but if your agency goes to a man's house because you suspect him of kidnapping girls and you find 13 videotapes and go through the trouble of taking them out of his house and back to the station, there's no f***ing way that you're just gonna not play them. What? Oh yeah, we got 13 tapes from that dude's house who we think kidnapped 2 girls. And coincidentally, this tape right here even has the actual legal names of those exact 2 girls that we think he kidnapped on the label. And even though we're already, put the effort into surveilling him every day for 6 months and searching his entire house, the tape machine, it's on the fritz. So yeah, it would just be, just too much work to even watch them. So let's just give them back to him without watching them at all. I guess that totally makes sense to do. And the real straw that breaks it for me here is, even if you expect me to believe that you didn't watch the tapes, you have, f***ing eyes. You can see the f***ing label that says the name of the girls that you're looking for right on the outside of the goddamn tape. Do you expect me to believe that you're all too stupid to f***ing read now? Like, this means that one of these sick f***s had to look Marc Dutroux in the eye and take a tape that says the words Julie and Melissa on it and hand it back to him. If you think I'm gonna believe that just oopsie daisy, aren't we so silly? No, that was completely and totally intentional, and there's literally no physical way that it was not. And imagine how empowered Dutroux must have felt to know that the cops went to his house twice, by the way. I didn't even mention that they were there again 6 days after the first search and still didn't rescue the 2 8-year-old girls that they knew were trapped there. Imagine how empowered that Marc would be here to know that the cops went to his house, searched it, found all of his videotapes showing him building a dungeon, putting girls in that dungeon, and sexually assaulting girls in that dungeon. And then, when he gets out of jail, for someone to hand him the same tape of him sexually assaulting the 2 girls in that dungeon back to him with the name of the 2 girls on the goddamn label. I think I can tell you exactly how empowered he was. Empowered enough to go back home, open the dungeon where the 2 8-year-olds had by that point starved to death while he was in prison because his evil bitch of a wife didn't feed them ever, and these gendarmes didn't break the wall and save them even after hearing children's voices, take them out, bury them, and then a month later proceed to kidnap 2 additional girls while the gendarmes did literally nothing about it the entire time. Until the 2 guys who the public liked, who weren't gendarmes, but were actually good people, Boulet and Connerant, finally did do something about it, and then they took one of them off the case for eating a plate of spaghetti. So, do you see now why 400,000 people thought that this was up enough to riot in the streets? For some more context on who the gendarmerie really were and who they really served, I think it would be worth listening to some words captured on Le Monstre from Jean Fermond, one of the lawyers in the Dutroux trial.
You shouldn't underestimate that the gendarmerie was a military structure. So they think strategically, they accept collateral damage. It was not a police force as you or me probably would think of a police force. It was a power mechanism. Gendarmerie had an internal system where there was an indication that the gendarme was involved in criminal activity. There was an internal ban on communication to the prosecutor. It had to go up the hierarchy first, and only with the authorization of the hierarchy it could go to the prosecution. So this was a culture. And that has led, for example, to the fact that the National Drug Bureau of the Belgian Gendarmerie, who was working very closely together with the DEA at that time, actually became one of the main drug dealers on the Belgian market. And the gendarme who found out that actually the cocaine was his boss's, he ran into that by chance, after going 10 times up the hierarchy and saying, we have a problem, there are kilos of cocaine passing and my boss is involved in that. He actually at some point said, the law says that I should go to the prosecutor, and he went out of its own initiative to the prosecutor. And the next day he was removed from his job. That guy ended up, after 40 years of career, as an investigator, as a specialized investigator, ended up washing cars in the garage of the gendarmerie. And there are many, many actually incredible stories in which the gendarmerie got involved in that period. Members of the gendarmerie putting a bomb in the car of another member of the gendarmerie, which happened here in Brussels, trying to kill with machine gun fire another member of the gendarmerie, which happened to Major Vernaye. It's rather heavy stuff. Huh? And all this is the 80s and the 90s. We are in the middle of a period where all kinds of stuff is happening in the gendarmerie, which is outrageous, which is far beyond what any normal person would expect or would believe, but it's all reality.
Which also all sounds very reminiscent of a certain agency in Langley. So you got the hat back on, and perfect timing there. So, on top of all of this abhorrent behavior by the gendarmes, let's again return to the slimiest man alive, possibly, Jean-Michel Nihoul. Now, I have good reason to believe that the boss that Dutroux tried to scare Sabine and Letitia with was in fact this man, Michel Nihoul. I personally believe, based on evidence covered in witness testimony that I will go over, that Nihoul was Marc Dutroux's boss, and that he was in fact the man linking him with a much larger child trafficking network. Some of the evidence I already went over was the fact that he basically gave Marc a payment of $15,000 worth of ecstasy after he kidnapped Letitia, the phone call Letitia overheard with Dutroux telling Nihoul that everything had worked and gone well after her abduction, and the little nerd Letivre saying that he was asked by Dutroux and Nihoul to join this child trafficking network that they were both involved in. When Nihoul was interviewed before the eventual Dutroux trial in 2004 by a woman from the BBC, he loudly exclaimed, "I am the monster of Belgium," and said that he did not think that he would ever be brought to trial because he had so much dirt on politicians and powerful people in Belgium, including blackmail videos of them engaging in child sex acts, that he would release if he was brought down, so these powerful people in charge would never let that happen. So, do you see why Epstein is in the title? It's not just clickbait, although it is. It's not just it is clickbait, but it's not just. Listen, Nihoul also told the German newspaper Der Spiegel in 2001, quote, "I control the government. Everyone has compromising dossiers on one another to be used as leverage in the right situation." And he even allegedly offered to these reporters off the record that he could provide a tape of Belgium's King Albert II assaulting a teenage girl for a six-figure sum. I believe that Nihoul acted as a sort of middleman between people like Dutroux and the ring's rich and powerful clients, VIPs, as they called them, VIPDF files, as I call them. Very powerful and very disgusting people who paid people like Nihoul large sums of money to engage in terrible, sadistic, disgusting acts with the children that he managed, I guess you could say. A large part of the specifics for that belief of mine on what I, for legal reasons, must stress is the alleged role that Michael Nihoul played in the Dutroux affair come from the testimony of women like Annika Lucas, as well as those folks that are referred to as the ex-witnesses, the victims we discussed that testified specifically about the wider trafficking ring connections in the Dutroux affair. Annika Lucas claims that she was a victim of this very same sex trafficking ring in Belgium, being pimped out by her parents before the age of 9.
My name is Anneke Lucas. I'm also a survivor of child sex trafficking. I was raised in Belgium and sold into a murderous pedophile network right around my 6th birthday. I was used in this network for 5 years and a half. Adult men that were part of this exclusive club were there for various reasons, but there was a lot of alcohol, a lot of drugs, and the children were the commodity, the highest, the most valued commodity, and were used for sex mostly.
The boss of the network, he gifted me to an international networker, and that man ended up taking an interest in me and taking me with him to train me. So I was 9 years old when this happened, and taken him to different places on the East Coast in the United States to learn about that world. That year, 1972, taken to different places, especially Germany. But still, even though I was gone the entire summer of 1972, I still would come back and go to school. I was, from then on, used in the network, by the Belgian network, mostly for the VIP guests that would come from then on. So 1972 to 1974, I was in fact taken away to be tortured. That torture was led by the person I knew as the middleman for a lot of the orgies, someone who was very happy to brown nose with the VIPs, the network, Michel Nihoul. I was given to him. He was the middleman, so he was rather new. I started seeing him maybe 1972, 1973, around then. He started showing up, but very quickly he became sort of indispensable as the middleman. That he dealt with the pimps, he dealt with the parents sometimes, if they were pimps, he dealt with the children. He arranged everything for the VIPs. He had no qualms. I got by, tried to survive a little bit by connecting to the human inside the man. Well, not with Nihoul. It wasn't possible. It was not that there's no human there, but he was so flat, and his jokes were beyond cruel, you know. They were so empty, but about the most horrific things imaginable. So, no way to get through. I couldn't get through to him, to have him as a person. I saw him more like a business person arranging everything until for punishment. Nihoul has me, I'm the one who's being punished, but other children are there as well. And so he is basically terrorizing us children beyond the imaginable in order to make sure that we will never ask the clients, in quotes, anything, the perpetrators, that we will never express any need of our own, that we will just be there and just shut up and just do what we're meant to do for them. And Nihoul grabbed my arm like that and twisted it, and then he put the cigarette out on my arm, which is this scar right here. Yeah. And I want to show you, because when you see it like this, it's circular, because he had my arm like that. But when you stretch the arm out, as you can see, it's not, it's a line, it stretches out. I was taken away into a separate little room, a secret room, I think, and tortured. And four children who were also, like myself, in this network, were taken also and had to torture me. So I was laid out and strapped down, and then Nihoul forced those children to torture me with there was a crate underneath this very large butcher's block, very old. Underneath was like a crate, an apple crate or something, which had various, he gave a fish hook to one child, he gave a screwdriver to another child, he gave a penknife to another child, he gave, various things along during the time that I was there, and, forced them to torture me, which clearly they did not want to do. Yes, and he, of course, participated. He, of course, was doing it too.
There were a number of aristocrats that were part of this club who also liked killing children. And then my time had come. At the age of 11, I was about to be killed. I was tortured because someone who had protected me for a while and then abused me really badly was done with me. I was strapped to a butcher's block that was black from the blood of all the children that had come before me. I was there for a few hours. I thought that I was going to be killed like all the children that weren't loved enough to live. And I was going to be forgotten as well. And I wasn't ready to die. That torture lasted a few hours. However, I was in that network for 5 years and a half. In that time, I was many, many, many times. I don't have any scars to show how many times I was raped, but I did the math. Usually it was a whole night in the weekend. And so I gathered that I was actually raped for about 6 hours a week. 1,716 hours of rape before I reached the age of 12.
I understand that people don't believe me. And I understand it. Because I think that if you allow this in, it's going to challenge your worldview, potentially, very strongly. You're going to say the world is absolutely not what I thought it was, and you may sink into despair or depression from allowing this reality in. So ultimately, people have to do their own work in order to accept that this is true. And it is not, it may seem really hopeless when you allow it in, but it really is for the betterment of humanity to go through that phase yourself and to allow that pain in.
Children are the most vulnerable of our population. So we want to create a society where children will be safe, where children will have a community around them. every child deserves safety. No child deserves what I went through and what millions of children each day go through. But unfortunately, the way the system is right now, that is part of the system.
Now, as far as the ex-witnesses' testimony, these were, again, victims relating to the alleged wider child trafficking ring that came to police during a project created by Jean Connerat, the investigating judge that was dismissed in the spaghetti incident that spurred on the White March. The most integral witness among them was X1, the woman named Regina Louf, who was also a victim of this child trafficking network, and as I previously stated, was the same person who provided police with the claims of seeing Nahul at child sex parties, along with Marc Dutroux, who she said provided girls as well as vast quantities of narcotics for these events. Regina also made some very shocking and corroboratable claims about murders related to this ring, some being murders of the child sex slaves themselves to prevent them from speaking out, including 3 of these victims who the police were able to confirm from cold cases were actually murdered. Regina also provided details unknown to the public that matched perfectly with the autopsies conducted, and many correct details about the locations of the murders that police interviewing her determined would be impossible to provide if she had not in fact been there. Probably the most well-known of these situations was a murder that occurred on an abandoned mushroom farm that burned down soon after this body was found there, where Regina provided details about the very strange layout of the farm that the owner of the farm and police said would be just impossible to provide if she had not actually been there, as well as details she provided about the method with which the child was murdered, which were also just not possible to provide unless she witnessed it herself. And at the child sex parties she discussed, Louf claimed to have met prominent businessmen, politicians, members of the police force and judiciary in Belgium, and the so-called ex-witnesses in general alleged many powerful people of being involved with this child sex ring, including officials from Brussels, a Flemish mayor, and even a former prime minister, as well as claiming that these sex parties were secretly filmed as blackmail by the ring, just as Nahul had stated. When Connerat was dismissed from the case because of the whole spaghetti incident, the new investigating judge assigned to the Dutroux case, who had never done the job before, fresh off the block, immediately disbanded the investigations into the ex-witnesses and the digging into the even larger child trafficking network, and even attempted to file criminal charges on the investigators who were involved with it, saying that they had been leading the witnesses into false, incriminating accusations of powerful people. And then that new judge was also forced to resign because it was uncovered that he had close connections to, you guessed it, who else? Jean-Michel Nahul. So if that isn't incredibly f***ing suspicious and lines up ridiculously well with the theory of powerful people pulling the strings here to keep this shit quiet, I don't know what would be. Even more incredibly suspicious circumstances include the fact that over 5,000 hair follicles were found in Dutroux's dungeon, and the now third judge assigned to the case just refused to test them, saying basically that they already knew that nobody else was involved, so why even, waste the police resources to test them? Basically the same argument as per the videotapes, where it's like, why the tape machine's on the fritz? Why waste $60 of the taxpayers' money to buy a new machine when we could just not watch the tapes, and hand them back to Dutroux himself, including the one labeled on the outside, Julie and Melissa. And also at the same time, other officials were lying and saying that they actually already did test the hair follicles and found nothing, even though it was proven that they never did. They were just conflicting and perjuring themselves all over the place here. At least 7 members of law enforcement were also eventually arrested for suspicion of being connected to Marc Dutroux and potentially assisting in the incredibly obvious cover-up here. But, of course, none of them were ever convicted. And speaking of law enforcement, it was also uncovered that a certain Michel Nahul once worked as an informant for, that's right, that lines up, the Belgian FBI and people who royally f***ed the investigation, the Gendarmerie, the Chef Boyardee. And finally, Dutroux himself claimed during his trial, and continues to claim to this day, that he did in fact work for a wider child sex ring under Michel Nahoul that serviced incredibly wealthy and powerful people, including Belgian politicians. He also claimed that 2 policemen had personally assisted him with the kidnapping of Anne and Effie, and I think, honestly, a lot of details of the official narrative that I gave you might be slightly altered in reality, just to protect the powerful people that were involved and make it look like Dutroux, his wife, and the little nerd Letivre and Weinstein had all acted alone. And then, another very interesting, dare I say, exciting event in the Dutroux affair occurred in 1998. At that time, the trial for Dutroux had still not yet started, and he was being brought to view his case files, as was his right as a Belgian prisoner, when he suddenly overpowered one of the guards, stole his gun, jacked a car from a civilian, and fled deep into the woods. That's correct. Marc Dutroux had escaped. After this immediately becoming major news and everyone in the country freaking the absolute out, Marc was spotted by a Forest Service worker and recaptured only a few hours later. Whew! Ooh, geez. In the end, it took 7 years after the arrest of Dutroux for his trial to finally commence in 2004. After a very harrowing trial for everyone involved that included the court taking the jury, journalists, and the 2 surviving victims, Sabine and Letitia, in a bus to Dutroux's house and showing them the actual dungeon to get an exact idea of how f***ed up this situation was, Michelle Martin, Dutroux's wife, was sentenced to 30 years, even though she only served 16. Why? Why would they do that again? What the f***? The little nerd Letivre was sentenced to 25 years and was also f***ing released early. Jesus Christ, what is happening? And Marc Dutroux was given life imprisonment, where he still, thankfully, remains to this day. And finally, Nahoul was acquitted. This interesting verdict came after a very strange incident during the trial where juror number 5 made a symbol of a gun with his hand and put it to his head and was dismissed from the case for this strange behavior. And the new juror that replaced him tilted the scales of plausible deniability in Nahoul's favor by 1 single vote, which all sounds very above board and not at all orchestrated by the powerful people involved at all. That sounds natural and like it occurs every day in trials around the world. Nahoul did end up being sentenced to 5 years for the drug charges that came from the $15,000 worth of ecstasy he gave Dutroux, and on criminal association charges between him, Dutroux, and Letivre, but was never convicted on anything regarding the elite child sex ring that he was, to me, allegedly, and so obviously clearly involved in, allegedly. Oh, and by the way, he was once again released early after serving only 2 years in prison. And even after all that, the conviction of these monsters and some of them getting out way too early, all of them actually, except for Marc Dutroux, the effects of this case are still being felt. This is because, disturbingly, as of today, over 20 separate individuals involved in the Dutroux affair have died under mysterious circumstances, including, but not limited to, Michel Pierrot, a nightclub owner who promised to produce new evidence about Julie and Melissa's kidnappings, who was murdered very shortly afterwards in a parking lot. Jean-Paul Timnu, who worked alongside Dutroux in his car theft ring, told a friend that he received important information about the kidnappings and disappeared shortly afterwards, with his severed foot being found a year later floating in a river. Bruno Tagliaferro, another man who worked with Dutroux in his car theft ring, he apparently told his wife that he was asked to get rid of the car that was used to kidnap Julie and Melissa, and that he feared for his life. His death was declared a result of poisoning after the autopsy. And then, when that guy's wife, who he told about being tasked with getting rid of the car used to kidnap Julie and Melissa, claimed to have found important documents relating to her husband's murder, she was then found burned to death in a bed soaked with methanol, which the police determined was an unaliving of herself. Yes, she definitely covered her bed and herself in methanol and lit that on fire, because that's such a common way of doing that, which is super painless and great. Definitely makes sense. Huy Gobel was one of the very few gendarmes actually trusted by the parents of Julie and Melissa, and was found dead with a bullet in his head the day Operation Othello started. Jose Stepp, 2 days before he was supposed to testify to the police with important information about Dutroux, was found dead with Rohypnol in his asthma inhaler, which you may remember was the same drug given to Dutroux, the government-issued roofies. Anna Konjivoda, whose body was found in a river sometime after she had contacted the police about Dutroux's connections to CP rings in Eastern Europe, and Gina Pardens, a social worker who worked with CP victims, who claimed that she had seen a snuff film in which an acquaintance of Michael Nahul killed a child, and had called the police saying that she had been threatened with death via car accident shortly before dying in a car accident. And that is pretty much where the official facts on the story end and where the theories begin.
Facts don't care about your feelings.
Let's look at the stats. I've got the facts. My money like Lizzo. My pockets are fat.
At least the CIA theories coming from me begin.
Dog, it's a yarmulke, homie, no cap.
So, as I mentioned earlier, this video is a very long, standalone entry in a project that I've been covering for more than a year at this point, going through the many crimes of the Central Intelligence Agency via the CIA iceberg. And the Dutroux affair is listed in the bottom, deepest, darkest, most schizophrenic tier of said iceberg in neon green, which means that it's not proven that the CIA was involved, and it's only speculation that they might be, as opposed to numerous other entries in the iceberg in olive green, which means that there's direct, undeniable proof of their involvement. And, you know, I will say that in any sort of operation like this that involves an allegedly widespread multi-continental child trafficking ring that's connected to some extremely powerful people, really anything that's connected to extremely powerful people in general, is probably going to involve the CIA in some capacity, several degrees removed or otherwise, just given that they are themselves powerful people and literally live to serve other powerful people. Now, I was actually able to get in touch with the creator of the CIA iceberg for this last tier, and thank God I did, because the CIA connections to these entries, and even kind of like what he means by the entries and why they're on the CIA iceberg, how they relate to the CIA, all that info would be just absolutely super hard mode, impossible, ball-bustingly hard to find without his generous assistance. He was able to provide me with a write-up that he personally created about the Dutroux affair and its hypothetical connection to the CIA, which is indeed several degrees removed. So I don't know how much closer you could get to straight from the source than the creator of the iceberg himself writing up a document about how it connects to the CIA. It's pretty useful shit. And even this theory here isn't claiming that the CIA and grew Marc Dutroux in a lab, or he's working for them gathering children for some evil CIA plot or some shit. No, the creator basically just posits in this write-up that there's maybe a somewhat tenuous connection between CIA officials, possible CIA operations, and the Dutroux-Nihol child trafficking network. Let me explain. So the creator of the iceberg makes clear at the beginning of his write-up here that his main sources for this information come from the book NATO's Secret Armies by Daniel Gansner and Joel van der Regeden's research into the Dutroux affair for the Institute for the Study of Globalization and Covert Politics. And the basic theory that he's trying to present is that 5 individuals who are all either directly implicated in the Dutroux-Nihol child abuse ring by victim witnesses, the so-called ex-witnesses that I talked about earlier, or accused of child sexual abuse by sources whose testimonies align with said victim witnesses. The difficult to pronounce names of these 5 men are Paul van den Boyenans, Baron Benoit de Bonvicien, Madani Boyhauche, Leon Francois, and Marshall Lequeux, or they would be if I pronounced any of them correctly. I think there's like a 1 out of 5 chance there. And what the creator says makes these men important in this case is that they all have ties to underground fascist organizations within Belgium. To understand why that is important, you have to have some understanding of the CIA's Operation Gladio. Now, this was a real proven operation that occurred. It's not a theory. The CIA did actually do this. And to give an incredibly oversimplified explanation, Operation Gladio was a CIA and NATO-run operation, hence the title of the NATO's Secret Armies book, which sought to secretly prop up and support fascist groups in Europe during the Cold War as an opposition to the Soviets, and to have them ready to fight in the case of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. Eventually, these same fascist groups took to engaging in violent attacks on left-wing groups and civilians within their respective European countries, since they weren't really doing anything other than sitting around on their ass waiting for a Soviet invasion that just was not happening. And a lot of these attacks were meant to be sort of false flag operations, which they attempted to blame on left-wing groups in order to discredit them and make them look bad and violent, even though in reality the fascist Operation Gladio supported groups were the ones that actually carried out these attacks. And in Italy, the time period that this was all going down came to be known as the Years of Lead, because there's so much lead bullets flying around that led to a lot of bad shit. So basically, the theory is that these fascist groups in Belgium, that these 5 men implicated in the Dutroux-Nicholl child trafficking ring are connected to, are part of a sort of modern-day CIA-backed continuation of Operation Gladio, having the fascist groups still placed in Europe under the CIA's command. And this is kind of what the creator alleges may still exist in Europe in the form of these neo-fascist organizations. Now, I won't go too deep into all the nitty-gritty details about the particulars of these 5 men and their connection to these fascist groups, which the theory posits are still connected to the CIA, because frankly, those connections are incredibly complicated to the point that I still don't fully understand them, and the specifics there are not incredibly important to understand the theory. All that really matters is that you understand this theory is saying some members allegedly involved in the Dutroux-Nicholl child sex ring, as accused by the victim witnesses, are also involved in these underground Belgian fascist groups, which may allegedly be connected to the CIA through Operation Gladio, according to this theory. This, if true, would then make the Dutroux-Nicholl child sex ring one step removed from the CIA through these men if their organizations really were part of a modern-day Operation Gladio. So, this theory, not the strongest case of CIA involvement in the iceberg, for sure. Okay, but what I will say is we do know how much the CIA loves to work through other groups, through proxies, if you will, to maintain their favorite thing in the goddamn world, other than shitting on the heads of communists, plausible deniability. The CIA loves to make their connections to all the shady shit that they get involved with as complicated and intentionally hard to decipher and uncover as possible by working with people in secret, off the books, and trying to put as much distance between themselves, the agency, and the crimes that they want done as possible. For examples of this, we only have to look at the numerous right-wing fascist militias that they've propped up in places like South America to oppose their left-wing socialist governments, with the goal of hopefully those fascist militias toppling them and instituting a CIA-backed, American-aligned puppet who often treats those nations' citizens much worse than the socialist individual and is a complete totalitarian dictator, but hey, he's beholden to the United States of America, so who really cares how shitty he actually is to his people, right? The Nicaraguan Contras.
We fought the commies inside Nicaragua. Our friends were the Contras. Freedom was their mantra, so we sent them lots of money for guns and landmines.
Who the CIA funded through some pretty fun little woo-woo powder trafficking. Cocaine.
But Congress stopped the Contra money flow just because they moved a teeny bit of blow.
Several steps removed to achieve plausible deniability are a great example of what I'm trying to posit here. So, with all of that in mind, Could the CIA be complicit in a child sex ring linked to Dutroux and Nuhol that through numerous degrees of separation might be helping to fund or be involved in some capacity with these fascist groups in Belgium that the CIA themselves might be supporting? And are they helping to cover up these crimes through all of the shady shit in Belgium around the Dutroux affair in order to hide their connections to these fascist groups just to maintain their secret deep state power over aspects of the European right-wing underground? That is certainly the very complex question that this theory and the connections laid out by it would create. And I'm definitely not saying yes to that. This is all very alleged, for sure, and there would need to be much more proof to come out and say with certainty that that is the case. But what I will say is it would not be the most f***ed up thing that the CIA has ever done. And that is really saying something.
Ooh, wee doggy, that was a long one. So long, in fact, that I forgot to record an actual outro. So enjoy this footage of the puppy we rescued last month. Isn't she so cute? Oh my goodness, look at her, oh my god.
Famous, Sugarfoot. You're famous! Oh. Hi.
Do you have anything to... yeah. She has bad farts.
Maybe they can smell them if we hold it up to them.
If this is your first time here, go check out the rest of the CIA iceberg. There's a whole playlist on my channel, and it's hopefully linked in the description. And guys, my last two videos absolutely bombed. They did, it's true. So go check them out if you haven't already, and I really need this one to do well, to like keep being a YouTuber, seriously. I'm not kidding. So please subscribe. And like the video to help it get bumping in the algorithm, and share it around if you can. Send it to a friend. I need views and therefore money to eat. Kind of important. I've been chowing down on a lot of ramen. Speaking of me needing money, go click that link in the description and check out Private Internet Access. It's affordable, high quality stuff, and supporting sponsors like them make sure I can, once again, continue to be a YouTuber. And speaking even more of me needing money, consider supporting me on Patreon if you somehow still have the money to in this god-awful economy. Just like these oh-so-generous folks, my god-tier patrons. Hunter K, AJW, Cannoli Rose, Mary H, Red D, Bim Wafty, James W, Steffi D, Cameron J, Operator Metro, Chase B, the Duke of Earl, Shalom L, Arya and Calcifer, and Rena J. And of course, my 20 buckaroos. Mike S, Bonky Donor, Simply Sleepy, Dark Duchess Nia, Tento Mon, Lando Calzone, Terry T, Snagowski, Trent S, Blarg, Fuzzy Viper Shark, Al the Pal, Adam K, Harabutica, and Rare Bees. As always, go down in the comments and tell me what devious deeds you got up to while you were watching this video. What were you doing? Shout out to that one guy in my comment section who's somehow always operating a forklift whenever I post. You're a real one. Also, do you guys want to finally see the second part of the Florida Man tier list? Originally, I wanted to wait till the first part got 10,000 likes, but I feel like I'm kind of leaving you guys hanging there, so please let me know in the comments if you want to see that. And until next time, guys, thanks so much for watching. I couldn't do it without you. Click the like button on this video. It's free. It's free to click that, and I need it. Okay, Daddy needs those likes to live. All right, please do it. I'm genuinely begging you. I'm shamelessly on my knees begging you to just like the video. And after you do, watch some of my other videos, like this one right here on the screen. Click on it. It's on the screen. Click it. Click the video. Watch the video. Put it on in the background. I don't care. Just do it. Please. Please.